They're called the worst of the worst. Monsters. Legends of evil. The names that everyone knows when you hear the words serial killer. But here's the problem. Some of them talked more than they killed. Some were caught because they wanted the attention. And some didn't last nearly as long as the mythology suggests. So the question isn't what they did, because that part we know is horrific. The question is whether fear made them bigger than the facts. Tonight we are pulling apart the crimes, the body counts, and the lies. And we ask whether these men were truly the most prolific killers in history, or just the ones who learned how to be remembered. I don't know why my hair, I've curled it and it's kind of given Lord Farquaad at the front. Let's just ignore that. So Dean Arnold Corll, I'm gonna have to say his name like Corll, because Corll, us Scottish people, we can't do it right, so Corll. He was born on December the 24th, literally my favourite day of the year. Why? Of 1939, and he was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Now, he would be the first child to Mary Emma Robinson and Arnold Edwin Corll. And honestly, whilst Corll's childhood is very far from ideal, because he did have a few things that went on that, is unfortunate, unlike a lot of other serial killers, he never had this really traumatic event that might trigger a killer. His dad was pretty strict, very strict, but he was in no way abusive to his children. He adored his children. He just wanted what was best for them. And his dad being strict was really just him having certain rules in place that he didn't want to be broken, which is understandable. I wasn't allowed out my front garden gate until I was 12. I followed that. And Corll's mother, she was extremely protective of her boys. She loved and adored them. She just wanted to make sure they were safe at all times. Compared to a lot of people that we've spoken about before, and even people that I know in real life, Dean Corll has quite an easy childhood in comparison. Now, I will say Mary and Arnold's marriage, it was far from perfect. They did argue quite a lot. They never really saw eye to eye, but they really did love each other. And they made their children aware of the fact that whilst mummy and daddy might argue sometimes, they really love each other and they really love their children as well. The couple, they worked really hard to sort out their differences, but ultimately it just wasn't meant to be. So they did wind up divorcing in 1946. And this was just 4 years after the birth of their youngest son, Stanley. Now, let me say that I know a divorce is such a hard thing to go through for a family, especially the way it affects the children. Children can blame themselves. It can be a really dark period of time, but the way Corll's parents handled it, they really ensured that their children's best interests were at heart for both of them, and they were very amicable for the sake of their children. And I have a lot of friends whose parents are divorced, and believe me, they've never became a serial killer, or know that I know of. So whilst this divorce is really hard on Mary and Arnold and the children, when Arnold was drafted into the US Air Force, it was really important for both parents to ensure that Arnold still had contact with his sons. And it was really important for Mary that Arnold still got to see his children and that her children still got to see their dad. And she actually relocated so this could happen. Mary and the children, they relocated to a trailer park in Memphis, Tennessee, and they had actually sold their family home just so they could be close to Arnold. And as I said previously, Mary and Arnold, their number one priority were their children, and they ensured that every single day they knew they were loved, they knew that they were cherished, and they knew that the divorce and the split had nothing to do with them. It was just mum and dad couldn't work out their differences, but they loved them all the same. So I guess we need to get back to the idiot of today's case, Dean Corll. So as a child, Dean was known to be very shy, very serious. He didn't really interact or socialise with other children. And despite this, despite his lack of socialisation, he would show a great deal of empathy for others. He really seemed to care about others, what happened to them. It really bothered him. He had a great deal of empathy. Which, I'm struggling to believe that, considering the monster he came to be. But Yeah, I don't know. Now, Coral, however, he did really struggle with rejection of any form, no matter how big or how small. This was something that would really affect him. In high school, he found it quite difficult because he was unable to participate in any sort of physical education because he had a heart murmur. And then the doctors had also discovered that he had a case of untreated rheumatic fever. And because he wasn't able to participate in the daily activities that every other child could, he almost seen this as a form of rejection from his own body. And yet, that's going to have a psychological effect, but it's not going to make a killer. So in 1950, Mary and Arnold, they really tried to reconcile, and they even got remarried. They moved to Pasadena, Texas, and they were willing to really work at their marriage. And like, they tried really hard, right? Like, they got remarried in 1950 and they were together until 1953. But ultimately, like, the problems that they had before, they never went away. And they just couldn't seem to work by it. So they end up splitting up, and Mary, she retains custody of all the children as she did prior. And yet again, although, you know, divorce is a really tough thing to go through, they still remained amicable yet again, and both sons were in contact with their father whenever they wanted to be, and they were allowed to go and visit him whenever they wanted to. So after the divorce, Mary decides that she would like to go do a bit of travelling, and I was like, how cute, you know, maybe travel to Bali, eat, pray, love, a wee bit for yourself, Mary, good on you. But she just went travelling around the south, and when she was travelling around the south, she would meet a travelling salesman. Now, the travelling salesman that she met was a man by the name of Jake West, and they hit it off right away. Love at first sight, instant connection, they really had that spark, and they wound up getting married. So Mary, Jake, and her two boys, they wind up moving to, is it Vidor? I don't know. In Texas. And it would be in Texas where the boys would get a half-sister, Joyce Janine. So Mary and Jake, they're like, you know, we've got this family, we've got 3 children that we need to provide for, and they get a bit of the entrepreneurial spirit. They decide that they are going to start their own candy company. So they start a candy company in their garage, and they call this a Pekin Prince. Now, Dean Coral and Stanley Coral, they would work in this, you know, garage candy shop day and night. Even whilst they were in school, they were, you know, working in the morning, going to school, coming home, working in the factory throughout the night, going to school, like crazy hours. They were in charge of like the candy making machines, and then also packing up the candy so Jake could sell it on his travel routes. So Dean Coral, he would attend Vidor High School in Texas, and like, he was described as being pretty well behaved. His grades were fine. He wasn't a genius by any means, but he certainly got by. Like, his grades were good enough that the teachers weren't having a go at him, but they were also like average enough that the teachers weren't praising him either. Now, Coral, he was a bit of a musician. He was in the school's brass band and he played trombone. And it's said that this was something he was really, really passionate about. Like, he absolutely loved it. And like, we love a musical king. And despite being, you know, a bit of a loner in high school because he didn't really like to socially interact, he did manage to bag himself a few girlfriends. I don't know if they like the mysterious silent type or if his aftershave just smelled really nice. But yeah, quite a few girlfriends through high school. So Coral, he would graduate from Vidor High School in 1958, and the family, they decided to move to the northern outskirts of Houston. Now, the reason that they decided to make this move was so the family would be closer to the city, and this was really good for the candy company because most of their customers came from the city. So if they're closer, people could just come pick up what they want. They wouldn't have to wait on Jake going on the travelling sales route to obtain their sweet treat. So in 1960, Mary, she asks Dean Coral if he would move in with his widowed grandmother in Yoder of Indiana. And the reason for this was just to help look after her. I mean, I think she had kind of relied heavily on her husband, and then when he passed away, she needed a bit more assistance. And Dean Coral had agreed to do this. He said that he would move into her home in Yoder, Indiana, and help look after her. And honestly, this seemed to work in Coral's favour because he would start dating a girl and they would date until 1962, where she would propose to him. Love that, queen behaviour. But she proposed to him, but Coral rejected the proposal. So at some point in 1962, Coral decides that he's going to move back to the area of Houston Heights. And this was so he could help out at the candy shop, make a living. And he wound up getting his own apartment that sat right above the shop. And then in 1963, Mary and Jake West, they would wind up being divorced. And Mary kind of thought to herself, I would like to have my own business venture, so I'm going to start my own candy company. The drama. So her candy business was called Coral Candy Company, and Dean Coral himself, he would be sort of appointed as the vice president, and his younger brother Stanley would be the secretary treasurer. Now, the same year that the Coral Candy Company opened and was in motion, a teenage employee of the company had went directly to Mary and complained about Dean Coral. He said that Dean Coral was making very, very inappropriate sexual advances toward him. A teenager, bear in mind, a teenager, and he was kind of, sexually harassing him. So Mary hears this and, she's like shocked and horrified, and she's like, oh my God, I need to do something about this. So she fires the teenager. She fired the teenager for speaking up. Instead of telling Dean, don't be a pedo, she fired the teenager who was the victim. So I'm sorry, Mary, but you're enabling him to do what he's doing. So Dean Coral, he would be drafted into the army in 1964, and he would serve for around 10 months before he applied for a hardship discharge. He had explained that he really needed to be home helping his mother run the family business. He said that she was really struggling to do it all by herself. And the army actually granted him an honourable discharge on June 11th of 1965. Now, from the army, Coral had been harbouring a bit of a secret, and he has loose lips one night and he tells some of his acquaintances that whilst he was in the army, he realised that he was a homosexual. He realised he was gay. Slay King, love that. And he even confided in people and told them that he had experienced his first homosexual experience whilst in the army. Now, people noticed when Coral had come from... My God, I can't talk! When Coral had come home from the army, his behaviour and his mannerisms around teenage boys especially had completely changed. He was acting like a weirdo. And also, once Coral had returned to the family business, the Coral Candy Company as vice president, drama starts popping off in Candyland, right? And the competition between Coral Candy Company and the Pekin Prince, his ex-stepfather's company, was popping off. Like, the tea was hot. Hashtag family feud. Now, because of the candy chaos, Coral decided that he was going to work all hours that he possibly could, just like when he was in high school, because he was like, no way is my stepfather's business going to take over the Coral Candy Company. Like, Pekin Prince who? He did not want their company being outshined. So in 1965, the Coral Candy Company, they decide that they need a change of scenery, a change of area. So they relocated to 22nd Street, and their shop was now like parallel to Helms Elementary School. Now, Coral, he was known to provide free candy to teenage boys. Yeah, teenage boys within this school. And ultimately, they all sort of, got to know him. They thought he was just a really nice guy. And they ended up calling him the Candy Man. Like, I'm sorry, but if you're getting called the Candy Man, that is not a good thing. You're spending far too much time around those children, sir, and I'm going to have to ask you to back up just a bit. So Coral Candy Company, they decide that they need some workers in because things are really busying up, which is great for them, but how do you keep up with business if you've not got enough employees? So Dean Coral is like, I know the perfect group that we want to employ. They're going to be amazing. They're going to get the job done. We should employ a group of teenage boys. Like, why, Dean? Like, let's be honest, like, why, you know? Now, Coral, he wanted to seem like he was like this cool kind of boss, and he decided to install a pool table at the rear of the factory, and this is where the young teenage boys and Coral could hang out on breaks, get to know each other, you know, play a bit of pool with each other. It is literally giving John Wayne Gacy to a T. And I feel like there's a lot of similarities between Coral and John Wayne Gacy in terms of their victims, especially. Oh, get chills. I know the good ones like Danny Zuko. So, in 1967, Dean Coral decided that he was going to groom a 12-year-old 6th grade student by the name of David Owen Brooks. Now, David Brooks, he had been one of the children that Coral was constantly handing out candy to, so Brooks felt like he had developed quite a nice relationship with Coral. So Brooks had started to socialise with Coral and then also the other teenage boys at the rear of the factory, like when they were playing pool. And he would also go on regular trips to South Texas beaches, again with this group of teenagers and Dean Coral. Now, David Brooks, he had glasses and he found that this made him a very easy target for bullies. He would be bullied pretty badly at school and he felt like he was a complete outcast. They would always make fun of his appearance, and disturbingly, it wasn't just children that would bully David, it was adults as well. And he really started to lean on Dean Coral because Dean Coral was the first adult or person in general that he had met that didn't make fun of his appearance. So at this point, David Brooks is really relying on Dean Coral for every aspect of his life. He really counts as him. He looks up at him almost like a father figure. And if he ever needed money, he knew he could go to Coral, and he knew that he could approach Coral for almost anything in his life. And as I've said, this young 12-year-old boy, he really looks at Coral as a father figure. He really trusts him fully, and disturbingly, Coral would abuse this trust in the worst way. So Coral had started up a sexual relationship with David Brooks after this period of grooming. He would pay David Brooks in cash and in gifts if David Brooks would allow Coral to perform fellatio on him. We know what fellatio is, right? We're all adults here, or at least we should be. Now, David Brooks, he would go on to drop out of high school when he was just 15 years old, and he was very much still involved with Dean Coral. And he thought, you know, I can drop out of school because Dean's going to be by my side, so I'm going to be just fine. Now, it was also around this time that Dean Coral's mother and his younger sister, they had moved to Colorado, and they had wound up shutting down Coral Candy Company. So at this point, Coral is feeling very lost after the closure of the candy company. Like, this is all he's ever known, it's all he's ever did, and he's kind of trying to figure out his purpose again. And the thing is having this candy company and being around these teenagers, that was what was allowing him to satisfy his depraved urges. So Dean Coral decides he needs some kind of job to keep him busy and keep him living a somewhat normal life, or at least appear to. So he would get a job as an electrician, and this would end up being his employment up until the day that he died. Now, shockingly, Brooks, who had been groomed by Coral, he would actually go on to be one of his accomplices during his horrific murder spree. This would be alongside another teenage accomplice, Elmer Wayne Henley. Now, some of the teenage boys that they would bring to Dean Coral for his sick, depraved, murderous acts would actually be some of their own friends. That honestly just baffles me. They would bring some of their own friends to someone that they know is going to torture and abuse them in the worst way possible and then murder them. Now, other victims would be some people that Coral had befriended himself and decided to bring back and kill for his own sadistic pleasure, and 2 others would actually have been employees from the Coral Candy Company. So Coral, he was able to lure his victims into his vehicle by promising these young teenagers that he would take them to a party or he would give them a ride to wherever it was that they were headed. But he would ultimately drive them back to his own home. He would entice them inside, and then once they were inside, he would ply them with like drugs and alcohol. And he would do this in the hopes that the teenagers would pass out and he could do whatever he wanted to them. Now, these young boys, they would be stripped naked and they would either be tied to Coral's bed or to a plywood torture board that he would have hung on his walls. And these victims would be brutally beaten, brutally sexually assaulted, and they would be so brutally tortured. And sometimes Coral, he would drag this out for days on end just for his own sick pleasure. And to kill the young men, he would either shoot them or strangle them to death. With these boys' dead bodies, Coral would tie them up in a plastic sheet and he would either hide them in a boat shed in southwest Houston, on a beach in Bolivar Peninsula, or Jefferson County, where he would bury them in woodland that was near to Lake Sam Rayburn. And what's just so sick is there would be several occasions where Coral would force his victims to either write a letter home or even call their families to tell them why they were absent, why they've kind of just went missing, because he thought this would buy him more time and that the families would just think that their children have moved out and ran away. Now, Coral, he would often keep the keys that his victims had, so like house keys, car keys, whatever they had on them at the time. And during his mass killing spree, Coral would play like musical houses, like he moved about so much. So on September the 25th of 1970, an 18-year-old college student by the name of Jeffrey Conan, he would vanish after hitchhiking from the University of Texas back to his parents' home. So at the time where Jeffrey is hitchhiking, there was also another student who was hitchhiking with him, but they would be dropped off around 6:15 p.m. and they were dropped off at the corner of South Vosh Road and also Westheimer Road. Now, this had been near the uptown area of Houston, so Jeffrey himself, he still had quite a bit to go before he would be home. Now, not too long after this first initial murder, Brooks had actually walked in on Dean Coral with two teenage boys tied to a four-poster bed. Obviously, at this point, David Brooks, he is freaking out because he has no idea what's actually going on here. And Dean Coral, he buys Brooks's silence with a $200 Chevy Corvette. Dean Coral would later tell him that he did in fact murder the two teenage boys. And it would be around this time that Brooks would start luring boys for Dean Coral because the silence had been bought with a $200 car. But it would be December the 13th of 1970 when Brooks would lure two teenage boys to Dean Coral's apartment. These boys were 14 years old, and that was James Glass and Danny Yates. Both of these 14-year-old boys were tied to torture boards. They were raped, they were tortured, and they were strangled to death and then buried in the boat shed. And what's just absolutely horrific about this is that James Glass was a friend of David Brooks. David Brooks, who lured him to his death. And just 6 weeks after this, there would be two brothers by the name of Donald and Jerry Waldrop. Now, Donald was 15 and Jerry was 13, and they would encounter both Brooks and Coral, who were basically out prowling for their next victim. Both of these young boys would be lured into Dean Coral's van. They would be taken back to his apartment and they would be raped, tortured, and strangled to death. And both of these young boys, just like James Glass and Danny Yates, they would be buried in the boat shed. Now, between March and May of 1971, there would be 3 more victims. So we've got Randall Harvey, who was 15 years old. He would last be seen by his parents on March the 9th. Then we have David Hillegeist, who was only 13 years old, and Gregory Malley Winkle, who was 16 years old. Both of these young boys would be abducted at the same time on May the 29th. Now, both would be killed at an apartment that Coral had been renting on West 11th Street, and Brooks was known to have participated in both of these murders. Now, Elmer Wayne Henley, he was friends with David, who had went missing. And because he was friends with David, for David's parents, he decided that he would go around with missing posters and put them around the town to try and help find him. But don't think too highly of Elmer Henley just yet. because we're going to get into it. So on August the 17th of 1971, there would be an acquaintance again of Brooks. This was 17-year-old Reuben Watson Haney, and he had been walking to a movie theatre when Brooks approached him. Brooks had said to Haney, you know, my friend Dean Corll, he's having a party and you're invited. You should totally come along. It's going to be really good. We're going to drink, bit of drugs. It's going to be a laugh. It's going to be wild. And unfortunately, Reuben, he would agree to go with Brooks to Corll's address. And when he arrived there, he would be strangled to death and then buried in the boat shed. This young boy is just walking to the cinema to see a movie and his life is ended. And then in September of 1971, Corll would participate in musical houses again, and he would move to an apartment on Columbia Street. And whilst he was here, Brooks and Corll, they would murder 2 more youths. So in the winter of 1971, David Brooks would meet Elmer Henley. Now, he would introduce Elmer Henley to Dean Corll, and initially, Henley was meant to be a victim of Brooks and Corll. However, Corll had decided that Elmer Henley himself would be a very, very good accomplice, and he would offer Henley $200 for any boy that he could lure to Dean Corll. Now, Corll had told Henley that he was involved in like a slave ring, and this is why he needed to lure in young boys. As if that made it any better and any more likely that someone would want to help. But Elmer Henley would at some point. We'll get there. So in early 1972, Henley decided to accept Corll's offer of $200 for every young boy that he could lure to Corll's apartment to be murdered. Now, Henley, he claimed that the only reason he did this was due to financial difficulty that his family was facing, and he was trying to help out with that. Now, Henley said that he would first participate in an abduction when Corll had moved to Schuyler Street. Henley had lured a victim to Corll's apartment, and they had tricked this young boy into putting on handcuffs, which again just makes me think John Wayne Gacy, because this is what he did. Corll would then blindfold him and gag him. Henley said that he would then leave Corll with the youth to do whatever he was going to do with them, which of course is murder. And I just don't know if I believe for a second that he thought Corll wasn't going to kill him. It just doesn't really make sense to me. I don't buy it. But unfortunately, the identity of this victim remains unknown. So then on March 24th of 1972, Corll, Henley and Brooks, they would abduct an acquaintance of Henley's, and this was Frank Aguirre. Now, they all went back to Corll's home in Rambler, where they were going to be drinking, they were going to be smoking marijuana. I can never say marijuana, I'm like marijuana, weed. They were going to smoke weed. Now, Henley claimed yet again that he didn't know Corll's intentions with Frank. And he also said that he would later try and persuade Corll not to kill Frank. But ultimately, Frank would be raped, tortured and strangled to death. And I'm sorry, but I just do not buy it that Henley did not know what was going to happen to his friend. And then on April the 20th, Corll, Brooke and Henley, they would abduct yet again another teenage boy. This was 17-year-old Mark Scott, and it would be Corll who would initiate this abduction. Now, Corll had claimed that Mark had cheated on a deal regarding stolen property, and apparently this warrants him needing to die. Mark was grabbed by force and he fought and he tried his best to get away from the 3 of them. But when he realised that Corll was pointing a gun at him, he had to comply, or at least he felt he had to comply. He thought this was the best chance he had to survive. Mark was tied to the torture board, where he would have to suffer through torture, rape, brutal abuse, before being strangled to death. Mark's body was then buried at High Island Beach. And Brooks had later stated just how sadistic Henley was. He had said that Henley was fascinated with how much stamina people had, especially when they were fighting for their lives. And he would just be fascinated and would enjoy watching them fight and fight and fight until they would eventually die. And before Coral had left the address of Schuler Street, the three of them would go on to kill two other youths. So first we have Billy Balch and also Johnny DeLome. Both Billy and Johnny, they would be tied to Coral's bed, where they were both raped and tortured. And Henley, he started to strangle Billy, and then he turned around and shouted, "Hey Johnny," to get his attention, before then proceeding to shoot Johnny in the forehead. It's said that the bullet that went through Johnny's head came out his ear and he was still alive, and Henley proceeded to strangle both Johnny and Billy to death. Both of them would be buried at High Island Beach. Everything about this case makes me absolutely sick to my stomach, but it's the fact as well that Henley, especially, apparently according to Brooks, seems to enjoy watching these young boys fight for their life and try and fight through the torture and abuse and do anything that they can to survive, and they actually enjoy watching it. So the trio, they had lured another young man into the home, and this was 19-year-old William Ridinger. Devastatingly, William would be tied to the plywood torture board. He would be raped and tortured and abused in the most horrific way, but he would be let go at the request of Brooks. So this young boy is let go because Brooks had requested it. Henley proceeds to knock Brooks unconscious, and then Coral ties Brooks to his bed and starts assaulting him instead. I think just to teach him a lesson that, like, don't interfere with what I'm doing. But again, despite this assault that Coral and Henley have committed on Brooks, Brooks continued to work with Coral and with Henley. So Coral moves again, so he leaves Schuler Street and then moves to an apartment at Westcott Towers, and during the summer of 1972, they would kill another two victims. So the first victim was 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, and he had last been seen leaving a party in the Heights, and this was just before midnight on the 19th of July. He would be bludgeoned to the chest before being strangled to death and then buried in the boat shed. And then on August the 21st, 19-year-old Rob Bunton, he would be abducted on his way to work. And Roy, he would be shot twice in the head, and then he would be buried in the boat shed as well. And then on October the 3rd of 1972, Brooks and Henley, they would entice two young boys into Brooks's Corvette. This was Jay Simonu and Richard Hembry. So once the two young boys were in the Corvette, they were then driven to Coral's apartment. And what is just absolutely horrendous is that very night, Jay Simonu, he was forced to call his parents, where all they would hear is the word "mama" be shouted down the phone before the line was disconnected. The next morning, Hembry, he would be shot in the mouth by Henley, and then both boys were strangled to death. Both of these young boys, they would be buried in the boat shed just above Danny Yates and James Glass. Also, I just really want to apologise because I know I'm throwing a lot of names and dates at you, but it's really important to me that I cover every single victim of Coral's because they all deserve to be remembered, and I don't want to just skim through and say, you know, he had X amount of victims without giving you their names and letting you know who they are. That's really important to me, but I do understand it is a lot of information to take in all at once. So in November of 1972, an 18-year-old teenage boy by the name of Willard Branch, he would disappear whilst he had been hitchhiking. He was sort of hitchhiking local to the area, and devastatingly, his gagged and castrated body would be buried in the boat shed, and it's just awful to think the pain and torture that he has quite clearly endured being castrated. And then on November the 11th, a 19-year-old by the name of Richard Kepner, he disappeared whilst walking to a phone booth. Walk into a phone booth. Like, we've had someone who's just walked into a movie theatre, walk into a phone booth, just doing day-to-day activities. They're like, they should not be in danger at these points, but they are. Now, Richard Kepner, he would be strangled to death and also buried on High Island Beach. Now, altogether, there would be 10 teenage boys aged between 13 to 19 that would be murdered between March and November of 1972. 5 of these boys would be buried at High Island Beach, and another 5 would have been buried in the boat shed. So on January the 20th of 1973, yet again, Coral is playing musical houses, and he moves to Wirt Road, which is in the Spring branch of Houston. Now, within just 2 weeks of moving there, he would murder 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. Now, Coral, he was there for a very short period of time, and on March the 1st, he vacated the premises. He would then reside in an apartment in South Post Oak Road before then moving again to 2020 Lamar Drive, Pasadena. Like, this guy, the homes are like on rotation. He's got so many homes in his roster. So between February the 1st and June the 4th of 1973, Coral would suffer from hydrocele, which is basically like an accumulation of fluid around the testicle. Karma. Now, luckily for the public at this point, he would have to have a break in his horrific killing spree to recuperate, because he's not so tough now when he's feeling like a wee bit of pain. And can I just state, I hope whatever he was going through, I hope he was in a mass amount of pain and suffering. It'll never be as much as his victims suffered, but my God, I hope he was in agony. Now, Henley at this point, he's moved to Mount Pleasant, and he tries to claim this was because he wanted to distance himself from Coral. But like, I'm having trouble believing that, because he's sadistic as well. In some instances was a victim of Coral's, but ultimately, he was a cold-blooded accomplice as well. He enjoyed what he was doing. But devastatingly, when June did roll around, Coral almost felt like he was making up for lost time. It said that during the point when he could not commit his crimes, he was incredibly restless, he was agitated, he was almost described as an addict who has had to go cold turkey. And he would begin another mass killing spree. So on June the 4th, Coral and Henley, they got back to work and they would abduct a 15-year-old. Now, this 15-year-old was William Ray Lawrence, and this boy would endure 3 days of torture before then being strangled to death and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Just 2 weeks later, another young boy would be killed. 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn, he would be abducted, strangled, and buried at the same lake. Do you see what I mean when I say that makeup keeps me occupied whilst I'm doing true crime and makeup? Like, I can kind of hold back the emotion that I feel, and then when I've not got anything distracting me, it's really hard to get through. So when I say makeup's my fidget spinner, I literally mean it. So on July the 6th of 1973, Henley had started attending classes at Coach's Driving School. Now, this was in Bel Air, and this is where he would meet Homer Luis Garcia. Now, the next day, Homer calls home to his mother and says that, he's made a friend and he's going to stay the night at his friend's house, and he would get in contact with her as soon as he could. Obviously, she's not going to be worried. He's with a friend, and that's fine. He can stay over and, just let her know when he's going to be home. But Homer would never come home. He would be shot and left to bleed to death in Coral's bathtub. He would then be buried at the same lake as the two prior. Then on July the 12th, 17-year-old John Sellers, he would be bound, tortured and shot to death, and then his body would be buried at High Island Beach. I don't know how I managed to time it so bad, but my makeup's complete and the story is not, so I'm just going to keep telling you the case. Just me to you, not doing the makeup, just chatting away. So at the time of July, Brooks, he was married to his now pregnant fiancée, which is just crazy to me to even think about someone like that in a relationship and also having a baby when they're evil. Now, this meant that for a period of time that Henley would be Coral's only assistant. Now, Coral and Henley, they would abduct and murder 15-year-old Michael Balch. And what I find so heartbreaking about this is the fact that Michael Balch was the brother of Billy Balch, who had also died at the hands of Coral, Brooks and Henley. Could you imagine being a parent and learning that two of your sons died in the most horrific way? It's so unfair. Like, how can two of these losses happen to one family? And there would be 2 other victims as well, and that would be Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones. And it would be August the 3rd of 1973 when Dean Corll would capture and murder his final victim, and it would be a 13-year-old boy from South Houston. This 13-year-old boy was James Stanton Dramala. James would be abducted whilst he was out riding his bike. This little boy just out having fun riding his bike around the streets that he believes is safe. And he would be abducted and murdered by these evil, evil monsters. Now, Corll would take him to his home. He would be tied to the torture board where he proceeded to rape, torture, and murder James. Now, let's just get one thing straight, okay? Because Henley really tries to act as though he was an unwilling victim and participant in Corll's heinous crimes, but he's equally as culpable in my book. He was enjoying this, he was having fun, he was sadistic and gained pleasure from other people's torture and other people begging for their life. He drew pleasure from. Now, as you can imagine, being friends with a killer like Corll is probably quite risky. I mean, after all, Henley was supposed to be a victim of Corll's, but because Corll decided he would make a good accomplice, he was spared. But it wouldn't be too long before Corll would turn on Henley. So on August the 8th of 1973, Henley lures 2 teenagers to Corll's apartment. Now, this is Rhonda Williams and Tim Kerley. Now, Rhonda would be the only known female victim to be lured to Corll's apartment. You know, like, Corll's only into teenage boys. Now, Henley, he would later say that he had no intentions whatsoever of murdering either Rhonda or Tim. Do I believe it? No. Apparently they were just there to party and have a good time, but again, I'm having trouble believing that. So this night, Rhonda, Tim and Henley, they are drinking quite heavy, they are partying, and they also sniff paint to get high. And like low-key, I think I've accidentally done that one time, because one time I was painting my nails and I was like really close to my nails. The fumes were crazy, and I swear the fumes went to my head and I was like, did I just get myself high on nail polish fumes? So anyway, they all drink, they get high, they fall asleep. Now Henley, he wakes up and he is shocked to find that he has been tied up alongside Tim and alongside Rhonda. Now Corll, he was screaming frantically and waving his .22 caliber pistol around at Henley, and he was screaming, "I'm going to kill you, but first I'm going to have my fun." We all know what his fun is, okay? I'm not going to say it, but we know. So Henley's tied up and Corll kind of like lifts him up and like carries him into the kitchen just so he can tell him off and tell him how fuming he is that Henley brought a female back to his apartment. He's like, that's not the aim of our game here. I only want teenage boys. Why would you bring back a female? Now, Henley, he begs and pleads with Corll to let him go. And he said if Corll lets him go, then he will participate in the murder of Rhonda and Tim. Now, Corll, he's no the sharpest tool in the toolbox. He's no the sharpest knife in the drawer. He's a sandwich short of a picnic. And he believes this, so he unties Henley and they take Rhonda and Tim into the bedroom. And when they're taking them into the bedroom, this is so they could be tied up to the torture board on the wall. Now, to tie Rhonda and Tim to the torture board, obviously Corll has to put down the gun. Now, when he puts down the gun, Henley goes ahead and grabs it. Now, Rhonda had said that it was quite evident that Corll's behaviour had completely shaken Henley. Yes, it has shaken Henley because Henley believes that he's now going to be a victim and that he's going to die, and he doesn't want that. But he was never shaken at Dean Corll's behaviour until he felt like he was in danger. But I'm just going to read a quote from Rhonda about like what she said about this situation. So she said, "He stood at my feet and just all of a sudden told Dean this couldn't keep going on. He couldn't let him keep killing his friends and that it had to stop." Now, Rhonda had also said, Dean looked up and he was surprised. So he started getting up and he was like, "You're not going to do anything to me." Now, Henley, at this point, he says absolutely nothing, but just proceeds to shoot Corll 6 times. and this would put an end to Coral's vicious and heinous murder spree. So after killing Coral, Henley, he picks up the phone and calls the police, and he says, "Y'all better get here right now, I've just killed a man." Like he's trying to be this knight in shining armour, like I've just put the end to a serial killer. But it's not quite true, because he told Tim Cairley, "If you wasn't my friend, I could have got $200 for you." Now, Henley and Brooks, they would be compliant with the police. They sort of described their involvement in the different murders, and they even offered to lead the police to where the bodies would be buried. Brooks, however, he tried to say that he didn't actively participate in any of the murders. Of course not. Of course not. Now, within just a week, investigators had found 17 bodies that were buried in makeshift graves and also in the boathouse. Another 10 bodies would be found on High Island Beach and also in the woods near Lake Sam Rayburn. The remains of the 28th victim would not be found until 1983. And the definitive number of the amount of victims that Coral actually had remains unknown, because it is thought that he did commit quite a lot of killings on his own as well, but we just know of the 28 that involved Henley, Brooks and Coral. Now, Elmer Wayne Henley, he would be convicted of 6 murders and he would be given 6 life sentences for his involvement in the crimes. Like, I mean, give him 28 life sentences just so every single victim has justice, but I mean, I'll take it that he'll be in prison for life. Now, Brooks, he was only convicted of 1 murder and received 1 life sentence. I don't know how they worked that out there, that he only did 1 and then Henley did 6, but again, at least it's life sentences. Wish it was a death penalty, but it wasn't. Now, both Henley and Brooks, they're described as serial killers, as well as Dean Coral. And let's be honest, they are serial killers. Okay, they might have started off as unwilling participants, okay, but over time, each of them enjoyed it. Each of them enjoyed the killing factor. They were sadistic, they gained pleasure from it. So yeah, they should be named as serial killers in the Houston mass murders. Now, Henley in particular, he remains a very controversial name to this very day. Now, he created his own Facebook page to promote his artwork from in prison. What is it with like every murderer turning into an artist? It's like murderer turned artist. I don't know how it happens, but there seems to be a correlation, because it's given John Wayne Gacy again and many others. And also, why is this guy on Facebook? Why has he got access to Facebook? This real... what? Now, Henley has also done loads of interviews regarding Dean Coral, the Candyman killer, and in one of these interviews, he states that his only regret is that Dean Coral isn't here now, so he could tell Dean Coral just what a good job he had done killing him. Now, David Brooks, on the other hand, he led quite a quiet and private life within prison. He chose not to really correspond or interact with Henley very much, despite Henley trying his best to like get in contact with his old friend. But David Brooks, he actually passed away in prison in 2020 from COVID-19, and that thing that, you know, we're not allowed to say. Like, I'm not mad at that, but you know, these people, they should be tortured and killed in the way that they take their victims. I wholeheartedly believe that. It might be quite controversial, my opinion on Henley and Brooks, but I believe that they are just as culpable. And I know, like, this is where it gets hard, because I know that Brooks was initially groomed. I get that, and I know that in that situation, someone that's been groomed by an abuser, it is very, very difficult to get out of that situation. I know, but we need to remember that Brooks did go away for a period of time. He had the opportunity to walk away, and he did at one point, but it's too late. And he also, when he did walk away, he had no intention of actually dropping the hammer on Coral or Henley. So I'm sorry, it's so controversial to say, but I think they're just as culpable. But I really want to know what you think on that, because I feel like that's really going to be like mixed opinions. But I just think if you can murder and enjoy it, then you are a cold-hearted murderer. But that is the end of another true crime and makeup video. I really do hope you found this one interesting. Again, I know there was a lot of names and dates thrown at you, but it's so important for me to ensure that every victim gets the coverage that they deserve. And I am just going to put up as many photos of the victims as I can right now, just so we have faces to the names. As always, please just keep these victims in your thoughts, your prayers and their families, because what they have all suffered and what they have all gone through is just beyond belief. It is the epitome of evil, and no one should suffer in that way. These were young boys with their whole life ahead of them that just were robbed of that chance. So please keep them in your prayers, keep them in your thoughts, remember their names, remember their faces, and let's help keep their memory alive. So, Edmund Kemper was born on the 18th of December 1948 in Burbank, California, and he was one of 3 children, but he was in fact the only son to Clarnell Kemper and Edmund Emil Kemper. Anytime I say or hear the name Edmund, all I can think is, was it not Narnia? One of the brothers was called Edmund, and was he not obsessed with Turkish Delight? They get caught off the Snow Queen because she was feeding him Turkish Delight or something? Or have I completely misremembered Narnia? But I swear, Turkish Delight played a part in this. Played a part in Narnia, not the Ed Kemper case. I mean, he might have liked it, but I don't know. So Edmund Kemper's father, Edmund Sr., I suppose, he was a World War II vet, and then after being a vet, he then went on to test nuclear weapons at Pacific Proving Grounds before moving back to California when he then became an electrician. Now, Clarnell Kemper, the woman, she's not the nicest person. She was an alcoholic, so she really struggled, but apparently she also had borderline personality disorder. But all in all, she was really nasty, especially to Edmund Kemper, Jr. and Sr. She used to always make fun of Edmund Sr. because he was an electrician. Apparently this was just a menial job. But it was stated by a lot of people, including Ed Kemper, that his mum's behaviour was always very erratic. You never really knew what mood she was going to be in, how she was going to be feeling that day, and it was very much like walking on eggshells being in her presence. When talking about Clarnell at one point, Edmund Sr. had actually said that suicide missions in wartime and the later atomic bomb testing were nothing compared to living with Clarnell. He would take that any day over living with Clarnell. And Ed Kemper also stated that his mum would never really coddle him or show him too much love because she was scared, and I quote, by the way, that by giving him too much love and by coddling him would turn him gay. So she was honestly quite nasty to Edmund Kemper, really nasty actually, and all of this just because she didn't want to coddle him. But I think as time goes on, you kind of realise that the way that Clarnell felt about her son Edmund, I think stemmed a lot from how she felt about her husband. I think she felt like they were basically the same person. Ed Kemper expressed that he started having really dark thoughts and fantasies from a very young age, and he did in fact used to decapitate his sister's dolls, her Barbie dolls, and he said that he would get somewhat of a sexual thrill. He said that hearing the little pop of the head coming off and then holding the head up by the hair and then their bodies just sitting there would get him off. Kemper used to always make his sisters play really weird, disturbing games. One he called electric chair, and then the other one he would call the gas chamber. He would have his sisters march him to his death, and then when it was the electric chair, he would sit in a chair and then kind of writhe about as if he was being electrocuted, and in the gas chamber I think he just coughed to death basically. But very strange games. I can't say myself that I ever played that. At one point in time, Ed Kemper was also stalking his 2nd grade teacher, and he was carrying his father's bayonet, which I believe is a big spear thing. I'll try and insert a photo in case I'm wrong. But he would carry that and stalk his 2nd grade teacher, and his sister Susan used to make fun of him and be like,
"Well, why don't you just kiss her?"
And Edmund would say,
"If I wanted to kiss her, I'd have to kill her first."
Ed Kemper had stated that he was in fact very close with his father, and he was absolutely devastated when his father and his mother Clarnell separated in 1957. This meant that Ed Kemper Sr. ended up leaving the family home, leaving Ed with his 2 sisters and his mum, who practically hates him. And once Ed Sr. had left home, this is when Ed Kemper's behaviour really started to get out of control. So when he was the age of 10, he actually buried his cat alive. He later went back to where he had buried his cat, decapitated it, and put its poor head on a spike. And like, things like that break my heart. I've got 2 cats and they are my absolute world. Like, I could not imagine losing them, let alone losing them to something so awful. And when they were 13, they also had a family cat, which Ed Kemper murdered again because he thought it was favouring his younger sister. Like, what? Why? And once Ed had murdered the family cat, he actually kept pieces of the cat in his closet till his mum ended up finding it and of course went absolutely ballistic at him. It's also said that Ed Kemper had a couple of near-death experiences when he was a child. The first one was that his older sister tried to push him in front of a train. Like, that's not a game. Like, that is attempted murder. And another time she had actually pushed him in the deep end of a swimming pool when he couldn't swim, and he very nearly drowned. Now, obviously, as we were saying, after the divorce happened between Ed Kemper's mother and his father, he was sent to live with his mother, Clarnell, in Helena, Montana. And she was neurotic, an alcoholic, she was abusive, she would constantly belittle Edmund Kemper, and she actually always kept him locked up in the basement because she feared that he would hurt his sisters, which, like, Clarnell, you're a bit crazy, but you're no far wrong. Clarnell would also mock Ed for his height because by the age of 15, Ed Kemper was 6'4". I was going to say 5'4", and I'm like, Anna, babe, that's my height. But by the age of 15, 6'4", like, he was a big guy. But his mum would say that he was a real weirdo, that she reminds him of his dad, that no woman would ever love him. And then by the age of 14, Ed completely had enough of this. So he ran away to Van Nuys in California, which is where his dad was living. When he got to his dad's house, he found out that he had actually remarried and had a stepson. Like, he had this whole new family without Ed. Ed only stayed with his father very briefly because his father actually ended up sending him away to go and live with his grandparents, and this was in the foothills in Sierra Nevada. This was 2 miles west of a town called North Fork. I don't know why I always want to say Norfolk. Norfolk? I feel like there's maybe somewhere in the UK that's called like Norfolk. Norfolk? What? Ed did refer to his grandfather as senile and said that his grandmother was always emasculating both him and his grandfather, which is kind of the treatment that like Clarnell was giving him, so not exactly a better situation for him. On the 27th of August 1964, Ed was sitting at the table in the kitchen with his grandmother, Maud, and a big argument breaks out, right? They were always arguing, but this one was a huge argument. At this point in time, Ed is only 15 years old, but his grandfather had gifted him a hunting rifle to go like shooting birds and things like that. So after this big argument, Ed storms off, goes away to get his hunting rifle. He comes back through into the kitchen and Maud is like,
"Oh, I hope you're not going to shoot more birds."
And those would actually be Maud's very last words because Ed continued to shoot Maud once in the head and twice in the back, ultimately causing her death. So now he's obviously shot his grandmother, and then he hears a car coming into the driveway and it's his grandfather coming back from grocery shopping. And apparently in Ed's mind, he was like, I don't want my grandfather to see my grandmother lying dead. So the best resolution for this in Ed's mind was to go out into the driveway and shoot his grandfather dead as well. Yeah, that was Ed's version of problem solving, I guess, by killing him as well. At this point, Ed's really like panicking, like he's like, oh my god, like what have I done? What do I do now? And he ended up phoning Clarnell. Now, to be fair to Clarnell, I do think she gave him the only advice that she really could at this point, which was to phone the police and tell them exactly what he had done, which Ed did do, and then the police came and took him into custody. So when Ed had been arrested and taken into custody, when the police questioned him on why he killed his grandmother and his grandfather, Ed just said that he just wanted to know what it would be like to kill his grandmother. And then, as I've already said, he said that he didn't want his grandfather to find his grandmother dead, so felt it was best that he shot him too. Now, the crimes committed by Kemper at this point were deemed incomprehensible and that there was no way that a 15-year-old who's stable could commit these crimes. So court psychiatrists had diagnosed Kemper with paranoid schizophrenia. And then on the back of the diagnosis received for Kemper, he was then sent to Atascadero State Hospital. And this is like a maximum security facility that houses mentally ill convicts. Now, when Kemper was in Atascadero, the psychiatrists there actually disagreed with the court psychiatrist's diagnosis. They believed that Ed had no sort of like interference with his thoughts. There was no like flight of ideas, any delusions or hallucinations, so they completely disagreed with the paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis. The psychiatrist at this hospital actually said that Ed was very intelligent, very introspective, and when they had measured his IQ, it came up at 136, which is actually 2 standard deviations above the average. So he was a really, really intelligent person. He knew what he was doing. So Kemper was then re-diagnosed because obviously this diagnosis doesn't work. So he actually was diagnosed with personality trait disturbance, aggressive type. Then in the future, they did retest his IQ, which came up at 145, which is crazy intelligent. I feel like it's very obvious because they always are, but Kemper was a model prisoner. He was actually trained by the staff to do the psychiatric tests and evaluations on the other inmates in the hospital, which is insane to me. Like, why would you have like a psychopath administer those tests? Doesn't seem right to me. They also deemed that Ed was a very good worker, which they said is very unusual for sociopaths. They were just really confused by him because I feel like he contradicted everything that he should have been, but he still was, but he wasn't acting like that, you know? They also said that Kemper had joined the JC chapter within the prison/hospital, which major red flag for me because John Wayne Gacy was a member of his local JCs and also the prison JCs as well, and that man was a terrible man. Now, it was said that during this time of being like a model prisoner, that Ed Kemper had actually brought in his own test. I don't know it word for word, so I'm just going to read it because I do have it wrote down in front of me. So he claimed to develop a new test on the scales of Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, specifically on overt hostility scale. And Ed Kemper said that during his time in prison, because he was allowed to do these tests on other prisoners and he kind of learned how they worked, he said that he was definitely able to manipulate a lot of people, including his psychiatrist. Ed Kemper also stated that he learned a lot from the sex offenders that he was locked up with. Like, a lot of his ideas or things to do came from the sex offenders. So, December the 18th, 1969 rolls around. Ed Kemper is now 21 and he is released from the psychiatric hospital. This was actually against the psychiatrist's recommendations. They didn't want him being released. Now, it was also against the psychiatrist's recommendations that Ed Kemper be released to his mother, Clarnell. You know, the woman who's a bit abusive, kind of belittles him, all of that jazz. But regardless, he was released to Clarnell, who had actually remarried, changed her name, then divorced again. Then by the 29th of September 1972, it was said that Ed had showed great rehabilitation and his juvenile records were completely expunged. Not a good idea, folks. Not a good idea. I'm just saying, not a good idea. At all. He was not rehabilitated, he was just biding his time. And he never actually bided his time because he had already killed by this point. So in line with his parole regulations, Ed Kemper did attend college and he hoped to become a police officer one day. This was the passion that he had. So he did everything that he could and he did apply to be a police officer. But do you know, they actually have height restrictions on police officers, which I did not know. And Ed Kemper was turned away and rejected from the police because he stood at 6'9", massive man, a massive, massive man. But he stood at 6'9", and this was just too much. This was too tall, well above the police regulations. So unfortunately, he was rejected, but he did remain friends with some of the police officers that he met during his time of, I don't know, going to interviews, something like that. And also, because of his size, they all referred to him as Big Ed. And he sort of called himself like a friendly nuisance, I think because he was still always around like the officers and things that he had hoped to work with. So yeah, he was deemed a friendly nuisance. It's also worth mentioning, because Ed had maintained like some relationships, friendships with the Santa Cruz police, he did often frequent the bar the Jury's Inn, which was a known kind of cop hangout. So he would go to the Jury's Inn and hang out with the officers. Also in line with his parole, Ed did work sort of like menial jobs, and this was before his employment with the State of California Division of Highways. And, you know, just in case you're wondering about Ed's relationship with his mother since he moved back home, well, not good, very toxic, arguing all the time, still very much disliked each other, and nothing had changed. In fact, it only got worse. And then there was one point when Ed had actually moved out to live with a friend, but at this point his mum would just constantly phone him, or she would turn up like surprise visits, like, hello, here I am. Like, even though their relationship was so toxic, but it's like she still wanted to have a hold over him because he wasn't in the home anymore. Unfortunately for Kemper at this time, he would go through phases of financial difficulty, and this would result in him having to occasionally move back home and back in with his mum, to then move out again and live with his friend, and then go back home and live with his mum. So Ed went on to meet a student from Turlock High School near Santa Cruz Beach. Now, this girl was obviously a lot younger than Ed, and in 1973 they did wind up being engaged for a little bit of time. Now, the name of this girl, her parents requested that she not be named and that her name not be released, so we're not digging any further into that, we'll just leave it there. So at one point, Kemper was in a bit of like a car accident, you could say, and it wasn't his fault. And you know what happens if you've been in an accident that's not your fault? You're entitled to a claim. Where there's blame, there's a claim. So he ended up winning quite a lot of money in the settlement of this, because he did wind up quite badly injured, and he treated himself to a 1969 Ford Galaxy. Now, Kemper began to notice that there was groups of young women who would hitchhike quite often. So when he seen this group of young women, he was like, do you know what, I just need to be prepared for the unknown. So I'm going to put plastic bags, blankets and handcuffs in the back of my Ford Galaxy. You never know. Then Kemper started picking up these young girls, and to begin with, it was just a case of picking them up and then letting them go peacefully, like not actually attempting to do anything to them. He did say that he picked up around 150 women before he actually killed any of them. At the point of picking up the 150 women, Ed Kemper did say that at this point he wasn't really feeling that sort of urge to kill, that sexual urge to kill. And he said that at this time it was before he experienced his little like zappies, which were, I think, like his urges. And of course, this can only last so long before he would give in to those urges and terrorise young women in California. Kemper would also state that the reason that he wanted to kill these young women was because they were apparently flaunting themselves in front of his face, and apparently they thought they could get away with any damn thing, and that society is already as screwed up as it is without this. So between May of 1972 and April of 1973, Kemper would go on to murder 8 young women. He would pick up hitchhiking young students, take them into isolated areas like within the woods, and he would either shoot, stab, smother or strangle these poor young women. Kemper would take the young women's bodies home and he would decapitate them and then perform a rumatio on their heads. And if you're not aware of what this is, I'll briefly tell you. So if you've heard of fellatio, that is the act of a woman putting it in her mouth. Erumatio is when the male counterpart is thrusting into the mouth. It's a lot more like they're in control. After this, he would then have sex with the dead bodies, you know, the dead bodies that don't have heads, and he would then dismember them. During his 11-month murder spree, Kemper would kill 5 college students, 1 high school student, his own mother, and his mother's best friend. Kemper did also say that he would look for young women after he had had an argument with his mum. I think this is when he was like most fired up. And he would also get really angry at his mum because his mum was working at a university at the time and she just point blank refused to introduce him to anyone. And like rightfully so, I don't like Clarnell, but in this case I see it, I see what she means. It's also said that Kemper thought of these young women as surrogates for his ultimate target, which was his mum. His mum was the one that he wanted to kill. His mum was the one that he hated, but he was using all these young women to try and get his anger out. So on May the 7th, 1972, Kemper is driving through Berkeley, and it's at this point when he picks up 2 18-year-old students from Fresno State University. The students were Mary Ann Pesce and also Anita Lucchesa. Now, Kemper lured them in under the pretense that he would take them to Stanford University and drop them off. So they're in the car and Kemper's driving for about an hour at this point, and they haven't caught on that they're not going in the right direction, and of course Kemper's not told them that either. So he ends up driving them out to like a secluded wood area that he's very familiar with due to his nature of work, and he's actually worked near this area as well. So Kemper then handcuffs Mary Ann, and then Anita is tied up and thrown in the boot. He then proceeds to stab and strangle Mary Ann, and after that he would go on to do the very same to Anita. And like the really weird thing with Kemper is like he's so awkward and like gets embarrassed very easy. Like when he was handcuffing Mary Ann, he accidentally grazed like her boob or her breast. And he was like, oh, whoops, sorry. Now Kemper did say that he really liked the kind of girls that he was picking up because in his mind, they seemed pretty like upper class, very classy, and he said that they weren't scroungy, messy, smelly, hippie-like girls, which that's his words, by the way, no mine. I don't think like that, but that's how Kemper was thinking, as if he was sunshine and roses. Now, Kemper puts the bodies of Mary and Anita in the boot of his car, and he's driving back to the apartment. As he's driving back, he is pulled over by the police for a broken tail light. The police don't suspect a single thing. They just let him go. They don't check the car, nothing. They just let him off with it. So he just happily drives back to the apartment. When Kemper gets to the apartment with the bodies, he photographs them, he has sex with both of the bodies, he then dismembers them, and then he puts the body parts into a bag and then he ditches the bagged body parts. And he was getting rid of the body parts at Loma Prieta Mountain, and if I've said that wrong, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. With the heads of the girls, he actually disposed of these in a ravine that wasn't too far away. Mary Ann Pesce's skull was found on the Loma Prieta Mountain, but none of the other remains were ever able to be found. Then on September the 14th, 1972, Kemper did pick up a 15-year-old dance student named Aika Koo. She was hitchhiking on her way to dance because she'd actually missed her bus. Now, he drove Aika into a really remote, secluded area as usual, and he did pull a gun on her, but he had accidentally locked himself out of the car somehow, and somehow he was able to leave the gun inside, and he was practically begging Aika to open the car door and let him back in. And this makes me so sad. Aika did let him back in the car. I don't know if she was thinking that maybe if she did this for him that he would let her go because she was showing kindness. But as soon as Kemper got back in the car, he choked her until she was unconscious, and then he raped her and killed her. After he had finished killing Aika, he put her in the trunk of his car and he drove to the Jury Inn bar for a drink. Yep, that bar where always like officer friends are, that bar. He drove there for a drink before taking the body back. And when he had actually came out of the bar, he opened the trunk of his car, so like the boot of his car, that's what I would call it in the UK. So he opened the boot of his car and was just standing admiring her body before taking her body back to the apartment and doing the usual to the body before disposing of her remains. On January the 7th of 1973, Kemper was back living with his mum, and at this point he was driving around Cabrillo College campus. This is where Kemper would then pick up 18-year-old Cindy Ann Shaw. As he normally does, he drove poor Cindy into the woods and he shot her with a .22 caliber pistol before taking her back to his mother's house. Now, when he got back to his mum's house, his mum was actually in the house at this time, so he was able to get Cindy's body upstairs into his closet, and then he would wait until the next morning when his mother went to work. He would take Cindy's body out of the cupboard, he had sex with her body, removed the bullet from her corpse so it couldn't be traced to him. He then dismembered and decapitated the body in his mum's bathtub. Oh! Kemper actually held on to Cindy's head for a number of days, performing a rumatio on it whenever he wanted, and then he did go out to the back garden of his mother's house and he buried Cindy's head so it was facing up at his mum's window, because he said that his mum always wanted people to look up to her. Like, oh my, he is the worst of the worst. Now, he did throw the remains off a cliff, but her head and her right hand could not be accounted for. Like, the head, right, we know that's in the gut. What are you doing with the right hand? What are you doing with the right hand? Then on the 5th of February 1973, Kemper had just had another heated argument with his mum, so he decided, right, I need to go out and search for another victim instead of addressing my problems like a real adult. So he went out hunting for another victim, and of course, he's not known as the co-ed killer for no reason, but he is going out to search at campuses. However, the police at this point are very aware that there could be a serial killer on their hands, so they have warned young women in college campuses not to get in a car with anyone who doesn't have a college campus badge. Now, where does Kemper's mum work? A college. What would she have access to? A college campus badge for her car. What did Kemper steal? A college campus badge. Yeah. Now, because he has this college campus badge sticker thing on his car, he is able to pick up 2 girls this night, and he did encounter them separately. So at first, Kemper picked up 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe. So Thorpe had got in and sat in the passenger seat, and she believed, obviously with the college sticker, that Ed Kemper was also a student at this uni. And then he was driving along and he seen what he described as a young Asian girl standing thumbing a ride, and this was Alice Liu. And Alice Liu was only 20 years old. So at this point, Rosalind is in the front passenger seat and Alice Liu is in the back seat. As they're driving for quite a long time, Kemper then begins to slow down the car and he turns to Rosalind Thorpe and shoots her. He then turned to Alice Liu, who was squirming in the back seat and cowering and covering her head and her face, etc. And he did actually shoot at her, but missed her twice. However, unfortunately, the third bullet did hit her on the temple. So this time, Kemper had decided to decapitate both young girls in the back of his Ford Galaxy, and then he took their headless corpses into his mother's house, and he proceeded to have sex with them, dismember them. He did dispose of their remains the next morning, but before getting rid of the bodies, he did of course remove the bullets so they couldn't be traced, and then he proceeded to get rid of the remains. Some of the remains were found at Eden Canyon just a week later, but then some weren't actually found until March. So on April the 20th, 1973, Ed Kemper is awoken during the night, and it's the sound of his mum returning from a party. So she goes upstairs, gets into her bed, and she's reading a book when she sees Ed enter her bedroom. She turns around to Ed and says, "Oh,
I guess you're going to want to stay up all night and talk now."
and Ed just says to her,
No, good night.
leaves the room and goes back to his room. However, Ed Kemper was just waiting on his mum falling asleep, so he would have the perfect opportunity to kill her. So once Ed is confident that his mum's asleep, he goes through into his mother's bedroom, he takes a claw hammer and bludgeons her to death. He then proceeds to slit her throat with a penknife. He then said that he beheaded her and then humiliated her corpse, so had sex with her corpse. And like this next bit, it's not funny, but like it kind of made me like a little bit, just because there is rumours, and they are just rumours, but there is rumours that Ed Kemper like put his mum's head on a shelf and just shouted at it for hours on end. Like, and I don't know why, but it kind of makes me think like that Criminal Minds episode when Gideon just goes into like this cabin or house or whatever and just starts like shouting to himself. I know he did it for good reason, but that's what I picture when I'm seeing Ed do this in an empty house to a head on a shelf. And apparently he also threw darts at her head and then cut out her tongue and larynx and put it into like the garbage disposal. However, the vocal cords would not like get mushed up in the garbage disposal, so the garbage disposal just spit it all back out. And Kemper literally said like something like seemed appropriate as much as she'd bitched and screamed and yelled at me over the years. So Kemper then hid his mum's corpse in his closet and then he went to a bar for a drink. I couldn't confirm if this was the Jury Inn, but like I'm assuming because this is where his friends would be, but who knows. Now, when Kemper got back from the bar, he actually invited his mum's best friend over for dinner and a couple of drinks. Her name was Sarah Taylor Hallett, but she was better known as Sally, so I'm going to refer to her as Sally. Now, with Sally, Kemper had strangled her and then hidden her in his closet as well, and outwardly there didn't seem to be any disturbance, but Kemper had left a note for the police. Now, I do have wrote down what he said on this note just to get it word for word. So he said, approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday, no need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of this horrible murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it, not sloppy and incomplete, gents. Just a lack of time, I got things to do. Just a lack of time, I got things to do? Like what? Like what? Like where are you going? So Kemper, as we know, had fled the scene and he did drive non-stop to Pueblo, Colorado. And he said he took a ton of caffeine pills to keep him awake because this drive was 1,000 miles. So Kemper left with 3 guns and hundreds of rounds of like ammunition. He believed that he was a target of like this huge manhunt. But when he got to Pueblo, Colorado, he realised that like nothing had even been on the radio. Like, had they even found his mum? Did they even know that he is a fugitive on the run? Like, I think he was a bit annoyed, to be honest. So he makes a phone call to the police and he confessed to the murders of his mum and also of Sally. But the police never believed him. And the police had actually said to him, like, I'll just call back later. And Kemper's a bit like, huh? Call back later. So he actually waits a couple of hours and then he phones them back and he asks to speak to one of the guys that he knows. Do you know, like one of those ones that he was quite friendly with? So he gets him on the phone and he confessed to this and the officer made sure that they got police in the way and then he was taken into custody. On May the 7th, 1973, Kemper was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Now, due to the explicit confession that Kemper had given and because it was so detailed, counsel's only option for Kemper was to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. And like, he is pretty much insane, right? But he also knows what he's doing. And it is said that Kemper actually tried to commit suicide twice whilst in custody, but the trial ended up going ahead in October 1973. 3 court-appointed psychiatrists did find Kemper legally sane, and Dr. Joe Fort interviewed Kemper multiple times, including one occasion under truth serum, which is basically this like concoction that apparently makes tell truth, basically. Now, Dr. Fort relayed to the court that Kemper was involved within cannibalism. He was partaking in that. Apparently he was slicing flesh from his victim's legs and then cooking it into a casserole and consuming it. Kemper was also deemed fully cognizant, and apparently he really enjoyed the thought of infamy and being remembered as a murderer. Now, something called the McNaughton standard was used, and I'm going to read word for word what that is because I wasn't entirely sure, so just in case you're not aware. So the McNaughton standard means establish a defence on the ground of insanity. It must be clearly proved that at the time of committing the crime, the party accused was labouring under such of a defect of reason from disease of the mind and not to know the nature and quality of the act that he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know what he was doing is wrong. But with this, it was very obvious that Kemper knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that what he was doing was wrong, and there was obviously severe signs of malice aforethought. November the 1st, Kemper takes a stand for himself and wants to testify in his own defence. So Kemper said that the reason that he killed these victims was because he wanted to keep them for himself, like little possessions. And apparently he was trying really hard to convince the jury and the people of the court that he was insane. And he pulled a John Wayne Gacy. He said that his body was being inhabited by two beings. One of these beings was the killer personality. Not like, oh my god, he's got a killer personality, but like a killer personality. Not the good one, an actual killer's personality. You get it, I'm sure you get it. And of course, he said that when he was murdering people, that he completely blanked out. He didn't know what he was doing because it was this other being inhabiting him. Then on November the 6th, 1973, a 6-man and 6-woman jury deliberated for 5 hours and they deemed that Kemper was sane. They found him guilty on all counts of murder. Now, Kemper apparently really wanted the death penalty and he said that he would accept death by torture. However, with a moratorium placed on capital punishment by the Supreme Court of California, this meant that the death penalty couldn't be invoked. So Kemper obviously was charged on all counts of murder and he received 7 to life for each individual count. And he was sentenced to a California facility. It was a medical facility for like the criminally insane, and this was in Vacaville. Now, crazily enough, Ed Kemper was actually incarcerated with some of like the most notorious killers of all time. So he was incarcerated alongside Herbert Mullen and Charles Manson, and he did say that he didn't like Mullen very much. He said he was a man that killed around the same time and same area as Ed, but according to Kemper, he killed with no good reason. Ed Kemper also said that Mullen was like a foot shorter than him, so he really enjoyed intimidating Mullen. Then at one point, like Mullen really liked to sing and apparently he would do it whilst the other inmates were watching TV. So when he'd done this, Ed Kemper took a glass of water and threw it over Mullen and told him to shut up. And then after that point onwards, Mullen ended up asking for Ed's permission for him to sing. And Ed had basically said this was him performing behaviour modification treatment. Now, Ed Kemper still remains in general population to this day, and apparently he is still being the model prisoner that he showed back in the day. Like, he schedules prisoners' appointments, he coordinates prison programmes, like he's so heavily involved. And Kemper has actually narrated over 5,000 hours worth of audiobooks for a charity for the visually impaired. Could you imagine being visually impaired and then finding out that Ed Kemper is narrating your audiobook? Like, I hope people checked what he was saying in these audiobooks and that it's actually the story and not his own sick thoughts. Kemper did suffer a stroke in 2015 and then was declared medically disabled, and the whole time that he has been in prison, his parole has been denied 9 times, and he actually waived his right to a parole hearing 4 times, and the next time that he is up for a parole hearing is July 2024. This year, Ed Kemper could roam our streets, but people believe that Ed Kemper is not going to get out and they're just like humouring him by giving the parole hearing. I think it's pretty common that after a certain amount of time, like murderers and lifers basically get this parole hearing, but there's no guarantee that he's going to get out.
Well, let's see. Bachelor number 1 is a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in the dark room at the age of 13, fully developed. Between takes, he might find him skydiving or motorcycling. Please welcome Rodney Alcala. Rod, welcome.
Now listen, I make no promises, right? But I am thinking, pondering, perchance, I might actually do like a little Halloween vibe makeup today. I'm always a bit like, it doesn't really sit right talking about like murder and doing like a Halloween makeup. But at the same time, I was like, Anna, be so for real, like we're halfway there, in the words of Bon Jovi. We're doing makeup anyway, so why not make it a bit spooky for the spooky season? But I'm not going to go like full out. I'm thinking like we do a normal makeup look and then add a bit of spook to the end, okay? Now I have to say, this Rodney Alcala guy, right? His hair. Maybe it was the vibe back then. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was the vibe back then, but he looks like he is trying very hard to be like the long lost member of Aerosmith. And if we want to go one step further, tell me why this guy looks like Charles Ingalls out of Little House on the Prairie. I'd say I'm showing my age, but I'm not. I was just brought up watching Little House on the Prairie. And he very much gives Charles Ingalls, apart from, you know, less kind and more evil and just a despicable human being, whereas Charles Ingalls was a really great guy. But anyway, I digress. This case isn't about Charles Ingalls. So Rodney Alcala, he was actually born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala, and he was born on August the 23rd of 1943. Now, his birthday is just one day before my little sister's. Obviously, she wasn't born in 1943, but she's August the 24th, he's August the 23rd. Should I be worried? Possibly. Little Rod, he was born in San Antonio, Texas to Mexican-American parents. His father was Raul Alcala Buquar. I don't know. And his mother was Ana Maria Gutierrez, which I love Mexican names. They're so pretty. 1951, Raul, Rodney's father, he decides that he should move the family over to Mexico so they can have like this fresh, new, happy life together. So he moves his family over to Mexico and then he abandons them 3 years later, just leaving them in Mexico. And listen, I don't know why he abandoned his family. Maybe he caught a glimpse of the future of who Rodney Alcala might turn out to be. But, you know, to move your family across state and then bow out, no great. Then in 1954, when Rodney was just 11 years old, Ana Maria, she decided to move Rodney and his two sisters. Yeah, I failed to mention that he has sisters, but yeah, he has two sisters. But she decided to move them to suburban Los Angeles for a new fresh start. Now, I have to say, Rodney Alcala, he was deemed to be very bright, very smart, very intellectually gifted by his peers, his teachers, his mother, his siblings. Everyone around him could see the great potential he could have. And in life, he could probably have went on to be anything he wanted to and do anything that he wanted to. But unfortunately, the things that Rodney Alcala wanted to do would not be legal and they would not be very nice. So, you know, not great. Not only was Rodney very gifted academically and did well in school, but he was also really popular in school as well. I mean, he really just seemed to get on with everyone. That included his peers and his teachers. No one really had too much of a bad word to say about him, but it could be a bit strange. But we're all a bit strange somewhere. Now, Rodney, he would attend multiple different like private schools throughout his youth, and then he would go on to graduate from Cantwell Sacred Heart of Mary High School. At this high school, he had been on the yearbook like planning committee, and he was also on the track team and the cross country team. So again, it just shows like he's kind of good at everything. Academically smart, he's good at sports, and apparently he's good at yearbook planning. He's an all-rounder. So 1961 rolls around and Rodney Alcala, he decides at the age of 17 he wants to join the United States Army to become a paratrooper, and he would serve as a cleric throughout his time. I have to say, it would be during his time in the army when some of his less savoury characteristics and personality traits would really come to light and make themselves known to people. Alcala's commanding officer, he had said that Alcala was vindictive, he was manipulative, he was insubordinate, so basically like not obeying rules and orders and stuff like that. And he would also be disciplined on several occasions for assaulting young women. That sounds like a police report to me, but let's just keep going. So then we're heading into the territory of 1964, and Rodney Alcala, he would suffer from like a nervous breakdown basically, and he went absent without leave from the army. So he hitchhikes from South Carolina to his mother's in California, like no telling anyone where he's going, he just takes off. Now, once he was, tracked down and deemed to be safe, the army psychiatrists, they would do like a psych evaluation on Rodney to see what's going on. And this is when he would be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And also during this psychiatric evaluation, they would measure his IQ as 135. 135, and correct me if I'm wrong because I doubt my IQ's that high, but that's smart. Is that smart? Or is that average? Is that average? I don't know, right? But seemed important. Because Rodney Alcala's mental health just seemed to be on the downward spiral, like it was just deteriorating by the day, he would be medically discharged from the army. So obviously with this, he's like, well, I need to find purpose, I need to do something. And since he was very much intelligent, he would go on to graduate from UCLA, the School of Fine Arts. He would then go on to study film under Roman Polanski in New York. I'll admit, everything at this moment in time seems to be quite positive, right? It seems as though he's getting his life together, he's trying to achieve things, he's studying hard, but under that greasy hair and under that charming surface was a monster who was just waiting to attack. And this would bring us to September the 25th of 1968. A young girl by the name of Tali Shapiro, she would be only 8 years old when she had to look pure evil in the eye. On September the 25th of 1968, 8-year-old Tali Shapiro, she was walking to school from the Chateau Marmont Hotel in Los Angeles, where her family had been staying for a little bit. And on this walk, she would be approached by a man, Rodney Alcala. Rodney Alcala, he starts telling 8-year-old Tali that he knew her parents really well, he was really good friends with them, and if she would like, he can give her a ride to school, and that would be okay because he knows her parents. Now, Tali at first, she is very much thinking, no way, like I don't want a lift from you, I'm more than happy to walk from school, thank you for the offer, but no thanks, creep. Now, unfortunately, Alcala, he was very persistent and almost demanding that he gives Tali a ride to school. He keeps informing her, I know your parents, like your parents would want me to give you a ride to school. They wouldn't want you going with a stranger when you can come with their old pal Rodney. And he keeps talking to Tali, and Tali's like sort of warming to the idea. And then he tells Tali that he is a professional photographer, and if she would like, she could come over to his apartment before school to see some of the cool like posters and photographs that he's done. And Tali agrees. So both Tali and Rodney, they arrive at his apartment, and Tali would follow Rodney inside. Now, almost immediately, once she enters through that apartment door, Rodney Alcala would knock her out unconscious with a metal bar. Rodney Alcala, he then proceeds to bludgeon Tali's head with this metal bar before then raping her. This little girl, let me remind you, she is 8 years old, and this grown man is raping her. Now, what this pathetic lowlife didn't realise is in the area at that time, there was a sales representative by the name of Donald Haynes. Now, he witnessed this whole interaction of Rodney Alcala taking Tali Shapiro into his apartment. And immediately he was concerned because Rodney Alcala was acting very inappropriately with this young girl. So he follows them toward the apartment to see exactly where they go, and he contacted the police. Thankfully, the police, they arrive quite quickly and they force entry into Rodney Alcala's apartment. Now, when they force entry, they would find 8-year-old Tali Shapiro unconscious, lying in a pool of her own blood. They then seen Rodney Alcala flee out the back door, but because there wasn't enough police there at that point, they had to decide, do they save this little 8-year-old girl's life, or do they go after Rodney Alcala? And in that moment, the police made the split-second decision to save Tali Shapiro's life. I am so glad they chose to save Tali's life. Like, she was an 8-year-old little girl, and a lot of people online, they do say, well, if the police had got him then, maybe he wouldn't have got out, blah, 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 blah. This is just not true because, you know, just wait till we get into the story, but I am glad that little girl's life was saved. Now, Tali Shapiro, even though her life was saved, she would have a long road of recovery ahead of her. She was in a coma for 32 days, and then she had to spend months recovering from the physical injuries, never mind how long it took for the mental injuries that she had sustained with the trauma that she would have to live with. Now, I have to say, Tali Shapiro's story with Rodney Alcala, it's not finished, but we are going to come back to that toward the end. You'll be happy to know nothing else happens to her from Rodney Alcala, but she becomes a crucial part of this story. So after fleeing the apartment, Rodney Alcala, he decides, I need to get the heck out of Dodge. I need to get myself elsewhere so the police can't find me. So he heads to New York and he would enroll at NYU. And for his enrollment, he went under the name of John Berger. In 1971, he obtains a job at a New Hampshire arts camp for children, and he goes under a slightly different alias, John Berger. Innovative. Love that. And I mean, it is fitting because Rodney Alcala, he does look as though he styles his hair with burger grease, so it makes sense, but it's John Berger to John Berger. Make a bit of effort. And what's crazy is around this time, Alcala, he would work in an office with another serial killer by the name of Richard Cottenham. Now, Richard Cottenham, he was nicknamed the Torso Killer and also the Times Square Ripper. Both of these men, they did later say that they didn't actually know each other. They never spoke to each other. They weren't in cahoots. They never knew that each one was a serial killer. You know, they just worked together. Cornelia Crilly, she would be just 23 years old when she would be found raped and murdered in her Manhattan apartment on June the 12th of 1971. At this point in Cornelia's life, she was truly just living her best life, achieving her dreams. She worked as a Trans World Airlines flight attendant. And of course, working as a flight attendant, that meant she was getting to travel all over, see loads of different places. Her mother and father, they were both very successful, which did help open doors for Cornelia, but ultimately, she was successful in her own right. She was a very, very hard worker. And Cornelia was just living this really happy life. She was in a happy relationship with her successful prosecutor boyfriend, Leon Borstein. They were just so in love, and the heartache that her death would cause Leon is just heartbreaking. Cornelia, she was known to be extremely sociable. One day when she suddenly just goes off the radar, absolute radio silence, people immediately get concerned because that is not like Cornelia. She stays in touch with the people she cares about, friends, family, or boyfriend. So it just seemed really off that they hadn't heard from her. Not to make it all about me, right? But see, if that was me in that case, no one would even know I'm missing because I am the worst, texter you will ever meet. And her loved ones, they're so concerned that they contact the police and they request a welfare check on her. The police, they go over to Cornelia's apartment, which is 427 on 83rd Street in Manhattan. Cornelia's boyfriend, Leon, he was waiting outside whilst the police went in to do their welfare check. Once the police forced their way into Cornelia's apartment, that is where they would find her dead. She had been brutally raped and then strangled with her own nylon stockings. Now the police, they go outside to Leon and they tell him what they've found, and Leon, of course, is breaking his heart. He is devastated that the person he loves the most is dead. Police say that they need someone to make a formal identification of Cornelia, but Leon refused to do this, and he refused to do this because he said he could not cope with that being the last memory he had of his girlfriend Cornelia. And it's just awful, but Cornelia's case went cold very, very quickly, and it would go unsolved for decades until the 2000s. Now, in this period of time, Leon, he was sort of thought of as the main person of interest. Like, they thought he could have been the murderer. Charges were never brought because there was never any evidence, because he didn't do it. But because the police had sort of made it known to the family that they were looking at Leon, Cornelia's family completely distanced themselves from him. And this just left Leon feeling like the worst human being in the world. You know, the family of the person he loved has completely disowned him, believing that he could have potentially done this to their daughter. The police, they had previously found Tali Shapiro in Alcala's apartment, so ultimately they knew who they were looking for, and the FBI in early 1971, they would put Alcala on their top 10 most wanted list. Posters had been distributed throughout the communities. They were in stores, grocery stores, places like that, and two children that were attending the arts camp, they seen this poster. And they recognised the man in that poster. But they recognised him as John Burger. This was saying Rodney Alcala. Police, they are quickly made aware that people know where Alcala is, and they would immediately arrest him and extradite him back to California. And I cannot even prepare you for how infuriating this case is going to get. But Tali Shapiro and her family, they had moved over to Mexico. They were trying to get a fresh start. They were trying to find a safe place where Tali Shapiro could recuperate, try and get her life back on track, try to heal from the trauma that she endured. So when the police came to Tali and her family, her parents refused to let her testify against this monster. They did not want to reopen these wounds that they were also desperately trying to heal. The authorities, they refused to charge Alcala with rape and attempted murder because they didn't have any primary witnesses. You know, the 8-year-old girl who endured this monstrous trauma. So they decide that they're going to charge him with child molestation, and he would only get 3 years in prison. How is this right? Even on the child molestation charge, that should carry so much more weight for a sentence. 3 years for this POS paedophile who's targeting young children. 3 years. What? And let me tell you guys, if your clams are not steamed right now, they're about to be, right? 17 months later, 17 months into Alcala's sentence, he is paroled. Yep, paroled. So, he's walking free. Just 2 months later, he's rearrested because he sexually assaulted a 13-year-old girl. Now, he would only serve a further 2 years for this, being paroled again in 1976. I honestly don't even know what to say. What do they think this guy's going to do? Do they think he's going to get out and be a great citizen, get a job, settle down, have a wife, have a family, be a provider? Hell nah, this man is a monster. So now 1997 comes around, right? And Alcala's parole officer, and I'll use that term lightly because what kind of parole officer does this? But he permitted Alcala to travel to New York to visit relatives. He's permitting this guy to fly from California to New York. He's a flight risk. He is a repeat offender. But sure, let him go visit relatives who he's not actually going to go see. Just 7 days into this trip, surprise, surprise, he strikes again, and he would murder a college student by the name of Elaine Hover. So Elaine Hover, she was last seen at her New York apartment on July the 15th of 1977, and her date book that she kept in her flat, that showed an appointment that she had penciled in with a photographer by the name of John Berger. John Berger. Sounds familiar. Now, later on that same year, 1977, FBI, they would receive a tip regarding Alcala about his attack on Tali Shapiro and that maybe he should be questioned in this. Yep, okay, at this point I'm thinking, they're doing their work, they're doing their research, this is looking good, let's get him caught. But they would question Alcala, okay? And Rodney Alcala, he's like, I mean, yeah, I knew Elaine, but you know, that was as far as it went. Like, I didn't see her, I didn't murder her. And because Elaine's body hadn't been found, police couldn't do any testing to link him to the crimes. So ultimately he was let go. Later, buried under heavy rocks on a hillside near Hudson River, Elaine's body would be found. Now, when it got out that Elaine had went to meet this, you know, John Berger guy, an aspiring model came forward and she said that she had been photographed by said John Berger and that he was a wee bit of a weirdo. So now we jump forward to 1978 and Rodney Alcala at this point, he is working for the Los Angeles Times and he would soon be interviewed by the Hillside Strangler task force team because they were thinking, maybe, just maybe, he was the Hillside Strangler. But of course, after the actual captures of the Hillside Stranglers, he was ruled out. So Alcala, he is like carrying on this false life of his, pretending that he's this high fashion, you know, high regarded fashion photographer. And he would manipulate a lot of young women and young men to allow him to take their photos. And a lot of these photos, they would be nude, they would be fully naked, these young men and women posing very suggestively. But he's a professional photographer, so like it's okay. That's how they were thinking and feeling. And now the part that you're all probably waiting for, because of course Rodney Alcala is known as the dating game killer, despite not killing on a dating game, but you know, that's what he's known for. So it's 1978, Lord knows how Rodney Alcala gets selected to go on a really popular like dating TV show called The Dating Game. I guess these people don't do background checks because they're having a literal child molester on their TV show. But, you know, who am I to say? So Alcala, on this TV show, he was introduced as a very successful photographer who in between takes could be found motorcycling or skydiving. Bitch, where? Be so for real, he can be found killing and targeting young women. Now, other bachelors on this TV show, they had said that Alcala was a very strange man who gave very off vibes, he had really bizarre opinions, and all around, he just made them feel uncomfortable. Now, somehow, again, listen, I don't know how it was done. I don't know if it was a bouncy blow dry that he had on the game show or that creepy smile that he's got, but he won the show, ultimately winning him a date with the Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw.
Oh, come on, over here.
Cheryl and Rodney, they're talking backstage, getting to know each other, you know, planning out their date. Cheryl feels this very intense feeling of something being wrong with this man in front of her. She was creeped out. He was a complete, utter weirdo saying some really weird stuff. And she decides that she doesn't want to pursue the date with Alcala. So she like cuts contact, which must have really have bruised his ego. He thinks that he's a ladies' man. And this would just shatter any psychopath's ego. But Cheryl had said she just wouldn't have felt safe going on a date with this man, and rightly so, because it is believed had Cheryl went out with Rodney Alcala, she might have ended up being one of his victims. Like, how scary is that, to know that you've stood and spoke with a serial killer and you could potentially have been one of their victims? Whoa. Now, just a little thing to remember is he had said to Cheryl whilst on the game show, the best time is at night. And, you know, we're going to get into it. You'll see. You will see.
Bachelor number one.
Yes?
What's your best time?
The best time is at night, nighttime,
Why do you say that?
because that's the only time there is.
The only time? What's wrong with morning, afternoon?
Well, they're okay, but night time's when it really gets good. Then you're really ready.
Alcala, he's feeling all battered and bruised. His ego's been shattered by this woman on the game show, and he just needs to relieve his stress and also make a point and claim what he believes he is entitled to. He's going to go on a killing spree in California. So we are going to jump back slightly to, before the dating game show was aired. So it's November the 9th of 1977, and the disposed body of 18-year-old Jill Terry Barcombe from Oneida, New York, would be found on a dirt path near Mulholland Drive. Jill, she had been bound like knee to chest, so her knees were literally up to her chest, and she was naked from the waist down. Jill had been strangled with a set of blue rope ties. She had also been sexually assaulted and beaten. It was also discovered that on Jill's right breast she had received 3 bite marks from whoever it was that had attacked and murdered her. At first, the police believed that Jill might have been a victim of the Hillside Strangler, but of course this would be quickly ruled out. And then on December the 16th of 1977, 27-year-old Georgia Marie Wickstead, she was found dead in her Malibu apartment. Georgia had last been seen when she had drove a fellow nurse, Barbara Gale, home from a bar one night. But she drops Barbara off and then she heads home. However, the next day she doesn't show up for work, which is really, really strange for her, and Barbara, amongst other colleagues, are immediately concerned. So her co-workers are so concerned that they decide the best thing to do is report her missing and request the police go to her apartment and see if she's there. Now, when the police head over, they force their way into Georgia's apartment and they would find her dead, posed naked on her bedroom floor. She had been strangled with her own nylons, her skull had been bashed in, she had been brutally beaten, sexually assaulted, and her genitals had been mutilated. From the scene of this crime, there would be DNA evidence and also a handprint that would later be used to convict Alcala. But of course, we're going to get there when we get there. On June the 24th of 1978, 31-year-old Charlotte Lee Lamb from Santa Monica, she would be found dead in the laundry room of her apartment complex where she had been living in El Segundo. Devastatingly, Charlotte, she had been sexually assaulted, she had been brutally beaten, and she had been strangled to death by a shoelace. And her body had also been posed suggestively, and Alcala's DNA would actually be left at this scene as well. He's getting very sloppy. Thank God. So then on February the 14th of 1979, 15-year-old Monique Hoyt, she would be picked up by Rodney Alcala, driven back to his apartment, where he proceeded to brutally rape her. After brutally raping Monique, he then took her to a secluded, mountainous area in Joshua Tree, California. Now, the reason that he had brought Monique here was because he wanted to fulfill his sick desires and take photos of Monique in complete terror. And then he would also take photos whilst he was raping Monique again. After this, Alcala, he then bounds and gags Monique and he begins a sustained evil assault on her where he proceeds to repeatedly rape her and sodomise her. When he's done doing this, he takes a rock and brutally bludgeons Monique's head with it. And somehow this 15-year-old girl is such a fighter, she survived this horrific ordeal. And when Alcala went into a gas station, Monique made a run for it and she was able to file a police report. And I do not even know how this happened, but somehow Alcala, once he was caught, he was actually released on bail, which his mother paid for him. How is bail an option here? Then on June the 13th of 1979, 21-year-old Jill Marie Peranto, she would leave work early to attend a baseball game. Now, the next day rolls around and she didn't turn up for work, and like many others in this case, her co-workers were very concerned because this was just so unlike her. So the police, they head over to Jill's apartment in Burbank and they discovered what they believed was forced entry. And devastatingly, inside that apartment, Jill would be found dead in her bathroom. She was posed sexually with pillows propped under her shoulder, and she had been sexually assaulted and beaten. Police, they found traces of blood at the crime scene because Alcala, the greasy-haired monster that he is, he's a bit clumsy and he cut himself whilst climbing through the window. And later on, once Alcala would be identified as Jill's killer, her friend came forward and said they had met Alcala multiple times at a club on nights out. It just shows you never know who you're surrounded by. And then on June the 20th of 1979, 12-year-old Robin Christine Samso, she would disappear from Huntington Beach in California on her way to her ballet class. Now, Robin's friends, they had later confirmed that whilst they were at the beach, a strange man, Alcala, and he asked these young children if they would like to do a photo shoot. Now, they all declined, including 12-year-old Robin, and they all start to sort of leave, go their separate ways. Robin has to get to ballet class, and at this point she's really worried that she might be late, so she borrows one of her friend's bikes in order to get there on time. But Robin would never make it to her ballet class. Devastatingly, it is thought that at some point between the beach and her ballet class, she was abducted. A lot of people believe that Alcala had offered her a ride to her ballet class so she wouldn't be late. And just 12 days later, a park ranger, they would come across the scattered and ravaged remains of Robin Samso. It was very clear that Robin's body had been ravaged by wild animals, and her body was found in the Pasadena foothills in Sierra Madre. Police, they interview and talk to Robin's friends. They're trying to get as much information as they possibly can to try and catch the person who had killed her. Now, her friends, they remember a lot of details about the stranger who approached them on the beach. So they provide these details to the police, and a police sketch artist is able to create a composite sketch. And this sketch would be very, very accurate. And this sketch ended up being so accurate and so detailed that Alcala's former parole officer immediately recognised him. So now I'm just going to give it a little try of adding a little Halloween aspect to this makeup. But basically, so the police, they are very much aware of Alcala's criminal past and the kind of crimes that he commits. And they believe this could be our guy. This would only further be solidified when they found an earring belonging to Robin Samso in a Seattle storage locker that Alcala was renting in his name. And when they found this, the police were very, very, very confident that they had their man. So in July of 1979, Alcala, he would be arrested without bail. Finally, someone's talking sense here, no bail. And he would then be put on trial for Robin Samso's murder, and he would be sentenced to death in May of 1980. And I wish it was that simple, but it's not. We're going to go around the hills here. So this verdict, it would actually be overturned by the California Supreme Court. Now, the reason for this was apparently the jurors had been misinformed of Alcala's previous criminal convictions. You know, they bring them up to speed, they do a second trial, and he would again be sentenced to death in August of 1980. So then, in 1992, the California Supreme Court, they upheld the conviction. However, Alcala, he would then file a habeas corpus petition. Like, mate, go and just accept your fate. Like, you're going to death. Just live with it, okay? Or, die with it. But still, just give it up. So with this, in 2001, a United States District Court judge, they granted this and overturned his conviction. And I just need to ask, was that judge, was it a family member, a relative? Because who's overturning that? Whilst they're preparing for a third prosecution in 2003, an Orange County investigator had learned that Alcala's DNA, sampled under a new state law due to his objections, matched the semen left at the rape murder scenes of 2 victims. Now, additional evidence, including a cold case DNA match in 2004, would lead to Alcala's indictment for an additional 4 murders of young women. Now, these young women were Jill Barcombe, Georgia Wickstead, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parantu. Now, as we know, all of these young women, they had all been posed very sexually in these carefully chosen poses. Now, there had also been another pair of earrings found in Alcala's Seattle storage locker, and these matched the DNA of Charlotte Lamb. As all these weirdos seemed to do whilst in prison, Alcala would write a book himself, about himself, and it was called You, the Jury. Now, in this book, he had basically claimed that he was innocent of the murder of Robin. Like, ridiculous, considering there's DNA evidence, but like, pop off. And also, whilst he was in prison, he had the absolute cheek to file 2 lawsuits against the California penal system for a slip and fall incident, and also because they failed to provide him with a low-fat diet. Okay, Diva. What? Like, no. Why do you think that you can do that? I just... doesn't make sense. I was mad because the slip and fall accident that occurred, I wish hadn't actually been an accident at all, and I wish that his neck had been snapped. But that's just me. So in 2003, the prosecution, they would enter a motion that requested that the Robin Samso charges and then the 4 additional charges of murder of these 4 other women, they should be joined together. Now, of course, Alcala's defence, they contested this, and their reason was because, you know, one murder, the jury could find reasonable doubt and therefore not convict him. But, you know, add on an additional 4 and make that an even 5, it's going to be really hard for the jury to find reasonable doubt. I think that might be the point. Like, you know, if you are guilty of these charges or you are believed to have committed these crimes, then they should all be put in front of a jury for them to make up their mind. Like, when I read that, I was like, seriously? And luckily, in 2006, the Californian Supreme Court, they would side with the prosecution, and in 2010, Alcala would finally stand trial for the murder of 5 women. So Alcala, for his 3rd trial, he decides that he is just going to ride Han Solo. He would like to act in his own defence. Personally, I love when they do this because, well, how dumb can you be? Now, Alcala, he would spend hours, and I mean like 5 hours, asking himself questions and answering them himself. Like, he would address himself as Mr. Alcala. He would ask the questions in this, like, deep voice, and then he would provide an answer to his own questions in his normal voice. Like, there was 2 of them there. Alcala, he would tell the jury that he was actually at Knott's Berry Farm applying for a photography job at the time that Robin Samso had disappeared and been abducted. Now, he was trying really hard to persuade the jury that he was not guilty of Robin Samso's murder. The other 4 convictions, like, he never really defended that much. He just kind of said, like, oh, I don't remember killing them. I think Miss Spider needs to go on a diet because I've done some of his legs a bit fat, but like, no body shaming here. Now, there would be a surprise witness who would make an appearance at this trial to testify, and that was no one other than Tali Shapiro. She was now 50 years old at this point, but she was here to make sure that those young women got the justice that they deserved. And she would be there to witness this monster finally be convicted of his crimes. So in March of 2010, Alcala would be convicted for the 3rd time and he would be sentenced to death yet again. And then in January of 2011, Alcala would be indicted for the murders of Elaine Hover and Cornelia Crilly. So in June of 2012, he would be extradited to New York to enter his plea, and originally he pled not guilty, of course he did, but then in December of 2012 he would change this plea to guilty. So whilst awaiting execution on California's death row, Rodney Alcala would pass away at the age of 77 from natural causes, which honestly just boils my blood because, like, these people just seem to get off so easy sometimes when they have made so many suffer. It infuriates me on an entirely different level. And he didn't even die that long ago. It was 1:43 a.m. on July the 24th of 2021. Now, 120 of Alcala's, photographs of these young men and young women who were naked, they would be released to the public to try and help identify other victims. 21 women would come forward identifying themselves from the photos, and 6 families would come forward to identify a loved one who disappeared and was never found again. In 2021, 68-year-old Morgan Rowan, she came forward to the police and she described being attacked by Alcala in 1968 when she was just 16 years old. In March of 2011, the police had announced that they were more than certain that Alcala had also been responsible for the 1977 murder of 19-year-old Pamela Jean Lamson. She had disappeared after heading off to meet a man who was going to take her photograph. In September of 2016, Alcala would be charged with the murder of 28-year-old Christine Ruth Thornton. She had been one of the women that Alcala had photographed before she disappeared. And Christine's body hadn't even been identified until 2015, when Christine's relatives had given DNA samples which then matched the DNA of the tissue of her remains. Now I'm just going to read out the last ones here just because I do have it in like a list form and I don't want to miss anyone. So Rodney Alcala, he was also linked to the murders of 20-year-old Cherry Ann Greenman, who disappeared in 1976. 13-year-old Antoinette Jean Whitaker, who disappeared with an unidentified man on the night of July 1977, and also 17-year-old Joyce Francine Gaunt, who was last seen going to meet an unidentified man on February the 16th of 1978. And honestly, who knows just how many more women fell victim to Rodney Alcala. For 30 years, a monster lived in plain sight. He was a church leader, a dog catcher, a father, and a husband. And he was also one of the most sadistic, prolific serial killers within the US. He called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill. And the scariest part of this whole thing was that he wanted you to know his name. Well, it's time. We're covering Dennis Rader, and listen, it's been long awaited, it has been long requested, but this man, I don't want to give this man any space. Like, what can I say about Dennis Rader? Well, I mean, maybe the fact that he has a face that is so grotesque that even his own hairline is trying to escape it. I mean, seriously, this guy, he looks like a vintage handbag that was dragged for 20 miles and then got caught in a dogfight. How this freak is still getting to use up oxygen is beyond me. But his name is Dennis Lynn Rader. Lynn, yep, Get your comments in about that. It's giving Chandler Muriel Bing. Friends fans, if you know, you know. He was born on March the 9th of 1945 in Pittsburgh of Kansas. He was the first of 4 children to his father William and his mother Dorothea Rader. His father William, he would work really long hours at Shell Oil, and then his mother Dorothea, she was basically at home trying to raise 4 boys, which, one's tough enough. And not only that, but she's trying to raise them in post-war Kansas, so it's not the easiest gig that Dorothea has. Now, this family, they were devout Lutherans, so think prayer, Sunday school, rigid moral structure, which, given how Dennis goes, that's kind of ironic. And somewhere behind this religious order was this void for Dennis. Dennis said that he spent a lot of his childhood feeling invisible, especially to his mother Dorothea. I mean, remember, he's at home with her, one of the 4 boys, and yet he still feels invisible, like he's not getting any attention. He felt ignored and completely overlooked, and he was desperate, and I mean desperate, for attention and control. And on the surface, like outsider looking in, it looks like they're just living all American. There's Cub Scouts, there's Boy Scouts, there's fishing trips, small town living. But inside his mind, he was already turning depraved. Dennis had developed very early, disgusting worrying signs. And he developed these fantasies, and these weren't normal fantasies by any means. He was fantasizing about women being his victim, women being at his mercy, bound, gagged, tied up, beaten, in pain. And listen, we're already crossing the line of weirdness, and now we're just going to go even further. He was stealing women's underwear. Like, if they're hanging out there washing, he is going up, unclipping the pegs and running away with the underwear. And then he later admitted that he was practicing autoerotic asphyxiation as a teenager. He was practicing this using a plastic bag. You know, like the kind of plastic bag that you get when you go to the corner shop to pick up a freaking Kinder Bueno? He was using that for his activities. You go into Dennis's room, he's stocked up on plastic bags. There was a certain moment in particular that Dennis would talk about in his childhood that really stayed with him for life. This was that his mother, she was trying to get something from within the sofa, and her hand or her fingers had got trapped in the sofa springs. So she's trapped here, she's wailing out in pain, like crying. Any normal child, any normal teenager, they're going to be like, oh my god, like what's wrong with my mum? Let me go check on her, let me make sure she's okay and get help if it's required. But Dennis, he's just lingering behind her, getting his jollies, like seeing his mum stuck, trapped and in pain. You know, little Dennis, or Big Sparky as he would go on to call his own penis, would be erect. He can't go help his mum because he's hard. And this can't be written off as a spark of puberty, because this is just a complete flare of pathology. Now, it's probably quite common for teenage boys to cut photos of women out of magazines that they find good looking, maybe put them on the walls. Some teenagers have naked women on their walls and their ceilings, right? Bit weird, but who am I to judge? So Dennis would cut these photos out of magazines, women that he finds so attractive, so arousing. But it wasn't enough. What Dennis would have to do to really get his gears revved was draw ropes and gags on them, make it look like they were bound and gagged, and then they were attractive to him. He would imagine that he had bound and restrained these women to have his way with them, and this honestly echoes his later crimes when he establishes himself as BTK. Just a complete sick freakazoid. Like I said earlier, Dennis, he was in Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, all that jazz, and disturbingly, he would really thrive in the knot tying expedition, okay? He was very, very good at tying knots. They were secure, they were sturdy, and he would use them later in life. He also became really obsessed with order, with lists, with organisation. He would write down his chores so he could tick them off. He would have things that he wanted to fix. And decades later, police would find lists of projects. Projects being a euphemism for victims. And let's just cue Cilla Black because surprise, surprise. By his teens, Dennis starts doing what all these sick, pathetic, weaselly cretins do, and that is killing and torturing small animals. And I'm sorry to say, but he would hang cats, he would strangle dogs, he would sometimes keep them in boxes where they couldn't breathe so he could watch them slowly die. Dennis stated that he felt like God. He felt like he had full control over the fate of these animals, but again, it wasn't enough. He wanted to have full control over animals, over women, over his victims. One time, one of the Raider family neighbours, they had come over and they were asking Dennis about their pet that had went missing. And Dennis just shrugged it off, like he couldn't have cared less about their pet. But let's face it, that's because he knows that it's dead and buried in the woods. His parents and other parents who didn't really know him, they seen this quiet, polite boy. But what they didn't know is that he was rehearsing for something far more sinister in his future. Dennis had later explained in an interview, when I was in grade school, I sort of had some problems, sexual fantasies, probably more than normal. All males probably go through some kind of sexual fantasy. Mine's was just a bit weirder than other people's. No Sherlock, obviously. Now, when it came to his education and how he performed academically, Dennis was sort of stated as being unremarkable. Shocker, I know. I'm expecting Einstein. He would graduate from Wichita Heights High School in 1963. He had average grades and, shock horror, no friends. He was described as being very socially awkward. He would often keep to himself. He was very quiet. He didn't really involve himself with anyone else. And he was constantly mumbling under his breath. It was said that he would become fixated on certain females in the class. And many people just thought this was typical high school boy behaviour, becoming a bit obsessed with the girl that they like. But this was just him being a complete creep. This couldn't be blamed on regular shyness. This could only be blamed on him being a frickin' weirdo. So after high school, Dennis is bouncing between jobs. He's a meat packer, and then he's a supermarket stalker, just odd jobs here and there. However, a hobby that Dennis picks up that he is able to maintain is breaking into people's houses and stealing females' underwear. He would steal their underwear and then also move around some of their stuff, leaving things looking pretty disturbed, as in, I've been in your house, but you don't really know that I've been in your house. There's signs, but I'm going to make you think it was you. And this wasn't just petty theft. This was trial runs for his future crimes. Then in 1966, Dennis, he would enlist in the US Air Force. He would serve 4 years. He was in Korea, Okinawa, Greece, Turkey. And whilst he was here, he would earn medals for good conduct, good marksmanship. And being in the US Air Force, it gave him something he so desperately needed and craved: discipline, order, patience, and the ability to mask his intentions under routine. So when he returns to Kansas in 1970, he decides that he really needs to work out the perfect disguise for himself. How can someone as depraved and sick as him, how can he go unnoticed? So he starts off by marrying a young woman by the name of Paula Dietz in 1971. She was a very shy, devout woman, and she had absolutely no idea what she was marrying into. The pair would go on to have 2 children together. They had a son and a daughter. Around this time, Dennis starts working for Coleman Company, that's selling like camping gear. And then from 1974 to 1988, Dennis would work for ADT, which they were basically installing home security systems. And can you picture the irony in this, that someone like Dennis Rader, who was a serial home invader, he was setting up security systems for people who feared people like him. And to him, this was giving him the ultimate power trip. Now, at ADT, Dennis Rader, he had earned a bit of a nickname for himself. He would get called the Blue Book Man. Now, the reason he was called the Blue Book Man was because he was known to always go by the book, follow the rules, and he would scold anyone for anything. And this could be something as little as them having chit chat during their working hours. Like, God forbid you go to work and actually enjoy it. Dennis decides that he's going to go back to school, and he would get himself a degree in administration of justice. Now, he earned this at Wichita State University in 1979, and yet again, isn't it just terrifying that a man like Dennis Rader could earn a criminal justice degree? This guy was sitting in classrooms studying how people like him would be caught. Did he simply just do this and enroll and get the degree so he could learn what not to do? And in all honesty, the guy was able to avoid capture for around 3 decades, so he must have been paying attention. Shame he couldn't have done that in high school, and shame he couldn't have been a better person. Presentation and reputation, that was everything to Dennis. He knew that he had to perfect this to have the greatest, most perfect disguise. So he cemented his community image as a family man and a civic leader. He would even lead the Cub Scouts, he was church council president, and later he would become the Park City compliance officer. And let me tell you, when he takes on the Park City compliance officer, this guy becomes a frickin' Hitler, okay? He was enforcing code violations everywhere. Neighbours found him to be very strict and incredibly hostile, and a neighbour had actually accused Dennis Rader of killing her dog over a leash violation. And he's got such a bloody cheek, because this is the same guy who's coming over to measure your grass to make sure it is exactly 1 inch in height, stealing your underwear off your washing line, going home, tying himself up, putting on your lingerie and posing for nude photographs. And listen, if putting on underwear and posing and binding and gagging yourself gives you your jollies and it's just you yourself, great, go for it. But don't steal underwear, and don't you dare come over to my garden, measure my grass, steal my underwear, and go home and pose in it when you've just berated me on my own front lawn. Now, behind closed doors, Dennis, he was spending all his time perfecting his craft. He was obsessively stalking potential victims. He was keeping a notebook of potential victims. He was mapping routes. He was memorising people's schedules. He would refer to them as projects, dehumanising them into tasks that he could complete. He also built hit kits, which contained gloves, tape, rope, and of course tools. Psychologists would later describe Dennis Rader as a classic sexual sadist, deriving arousal from total control and suffering. But little Denny boy, he didn't see this as pathology, he seen this as his factor X, not to be confused with the X factor. Dennis certainly didn't have the X factor. But he described this factor X as this mysterious force that drove him to do what he did. You know, the typical, it wasn't me, it was Patricia. But in reality, it was actually decades of a heavily nurtured fantasy that was now ready to explode. And it would be in 1974 when Dennis Rader, he would finally graduate from fantasy into reality. This is when he broke into the Otero family home, leaving behind 4 bodies: Joseph, Julie, Joseph Jr. and Josephine. And when we dive in to what Dennis Rader did to this family, you'll understand why Wichita and the rest of the world came to know him by 3 morbid letters, BTK, meaning bind, torture, kill. So it is a Monday morning in Wichita. It is January the 15th of 1974. We're at a neat little house at 803 North Edgemoor. And this is where a family was just getting ready to start their day. Whilst this family is getting ready to start their day, Dennis, he would park close enough to the house that, you know, he could get there quick enough, but far enough away that his car couldn't really be described as being at the crime scene. So he exits his vehicle, he goes over to the family house, he scales the fence, and then cuts their phone lines. Now obviously he's done this so when he goes into the house, no one can call for help. Now he's been monitoring the family routine, okay? So he expects that the father, the son, and the other siblings are going to be out of the house and it should just be Julie and Josephine inside. But that wouldn't be the case. Dennis very quickly realises that while some of the siblings are away to school, in the home is Joseph Sr., Joseph Jr., Julie and Josephine. Now Josephine was 11 years old and Joseph Jr., he was only 9 years old. So Dennis is in the back garden and this is when Joseph Sr. would come out to let his dog out for the toilet in the morning. And when he lets his dog outside, this is when he encounters Dennis Rader, who's holding a pistol. Now, Dennis Rader tells Joseph, I'm a wanted fugitive, I'm on the run, I need food, I need money, and I need a vehicle. Now, Dennis Rader, pretending to be this fugitive, he tells Joseph, listen, no one's going to get hurt as long as you cooperate and give me what I need. I'll be out of your hair. And this is a promise he made that he would keep for exactly 0.3 seconds. Because as soon as Dennis Rader enters this home, he would guide the family to a bedroom where he would bind them with rope. Now, it is weird because Dennis Rader, he said that he allowed the family to adjust their positions because Joseph Sr., he was complaining that the circulation was being cut off from where they had been bound. And Dennis Rader, he's faking this compassion while setting up controlled suffocation. Because Dennis Rader, he then takes a plastic bag, he places this over Joseph Sr.'s head and then secures it with rope. So he's just letting Joseph suffocate in front of his wife and his 2 children. However, Joseph, he is able to chew a hole through the bag. But Dennis would notice this, and when he does, he replaces the bag and he secures it again, and this time he would watch as Joseph suffocated to death. He would then go over to Julie, the mum and the wife in this situation, and he strangled her with rope. Again, both her children are there. Both her children are watching this happen. So he strangles her, chokes her out, but Julie regains consciousness. And when she does, she only has one plea to Dennis, and that is to leave her children alone. Kill them, leave the children. They're innocent, they don't deserve this. And this sick freak, he just looked at her and then proceeded to strangle her to death. Dennis Rader, he then grabs a plastic bag, 2 t-shirts and another plastic bag, and he would secure these over the head of Joseph Jr. He set up this little boy's brutal suffocation. I mean, this little boy had absolutely no hope of survival. He's put plastic bag, 2 t-shirts, another plastic bag, tied it with rope, and then he goes and sits on a chair in the bedroom whilst he watches this little boy suffocate to death. 11-year-old Josephine at this point, she has watched her family be murdered, and now the only person left is her. Dennis Rader, he would take 11-year-old Josephine down to the basement. He forces her to remove her clothes and he pulls off her underwear. She is of course resisting. She is trying to fight her way away from him, but ultimately he overpowers her. Dennis Rader, he had tied a noose to a sewer pipe within the basement, and when Josephine sees this, she asks Dennis Rader, "What's going to happen to me?" And he coldly tells her, "You're going to go to heaven with the rest of your family." He would then hang Josephine, this 11-year-old little girl, from a sewer pipe naked, whilst he watched and masturbated over it. Once Josephine was dead, he then went around the house taking photos of the bodies, and then before he leaves, he steals some of Josephine's underwear. And honestly, this guy is just so beyond sick and depraved and evil and pathetic and just... oh, I hate him. I hate him so much. Now, Dennis, when he was on his way out of the Otero family home, he would take their vehicle. He then drove to a Dillon's grocery store, and when he was here, he realises, crap, I've left my knife in their backyard. So this is when he drove his own car back to the house to retrieve the knife. Once he has this knife, he then heads home for the day, like, you know, day done, chore finished, project complete. He goes home to his wife, he gets ready for church, and off they go. This man has just brutally murdered an entire family. He goes home to his wife, and they head off to church together. It would later be revealed that Dennis had been stalking the Otero family for 2 weeks when he had spotted Julie taking the children to school. And do you know what else is so heartbreaking about the Otero family case? Is that the 3 people who would find that family were the remaining children who had already been at school that day. They found their siblings and their parents dead. And not even 3 months after the Otero family murders, on April the 4th of 1974, Dennis would try it again. And this time he was targeting 21-year-old Catherine Bright. He would later refer to her murder as Project Lights Out. And again, Dennis Rader, he is, watching his victims. He is monitoring closely their routines. So he breaks in through a back door when he knows that Catherine is not going to be in. Once he breaks in, he then sweeps up the glass so that when she comes home, she won't be suspicious. Now, when Catherine arrives home, she arrives home with her brother Kevin, who was 19 years old. And this really puts a spanner in the works because Dennis, he liked to avoid males at all costs because that could mean that his plans don't go to plan, because these males could be stronger than him. They might be able to overpower him, and he hated that idea. However, Dennis knew that he had something that the family might not, and that was he had weapons. He had a plan. So he comes out, he surprises Catherine and Kevin, and he tells them the same spiel. I'm a wanted felon, I'm a fugitive on the run, I need a car, I need money, I need food, and then I'll be on my merry way. He was described by Kevin as being someone who sweated profusely, and I bet this guy just stunk. So Dennis, he then forces Kevin to tie up Catherine. After he's done that, Dennis would then bound him. The 2 of them were separated into 2 completely different rooms. Kevin was tied to a bedpost, and then Catherine, she was tied to a chair. And of course, Dennis, he's worried that, people might suspect that something's wrong if they can hear screaming and begging and pleading. So he turns on the living room stereo to drown out any noise. Dennis then re-enters the bedroom where he has Kevin tied up to the bedpost, Only, shock horror to Dennis, Kevin has been able to free himself. Now, a struggle would break out between the two. There's a sort of like tussle going on. Dennis Rader, he takes out a gun and he shoots Kevin 3 times. One on the forehead, one above the mouth, and one that just grazed him. Now, you'd think a gunshot to the forehead, a gunshot above the mouth, that's going to be something that kills Kevin. So Kevin's on the floor and Dennis, he exits the bedroom thinking that Kevin's dead. Little does he know, Kevin, by some miracle, has survived. He is currently playing dead until Dennis leaves. The second that Dennis Rader is out of this room and out of sight, Kevin then runs from the house, he runs to a neighbour, he tells them exactly what's going on and they call the police. Rader at this point, he's re-entered the room that Catherine's in. He tells Catherine, "I've just shot your brother dead." And at this point, Catherine is like, no way, I am fighting you back. This is not going to go down the way that you think it is. So a tussle breaks out between them. Catherine is fighting back and she is actually too strong for Dennis to be able to strangle her. But devastatingly, Dennis has come prepared for every scenario. So he takes out a knife and he stabs Catherine repeatedly under the ribcage. Once he believes that Catherine's dead, he runs downstairs, he grabs the keys to her truck, goes out to her truck, but the idiot can't get it started. He then has to return to his own vehicle at WSU and use that to escape the crime scene. Now, the police, they arrive shortly after, and when they do, Catherine is still, she's still alive. She's kind of verbally unresponsive though. She's really struggling, but she's still alive. Catherine makes it to the hospital. She makes it into emergency surgery. But it was during this surgery she would pass away. So October of 1974, Dennis Rader, he sends a letter to the Wichita Eagle, right? And in this letter, he refers to himself as BTK. He wants to ensure that everyone knows that there was only one person responsible for these murders, and it was BTK. This man is such an attention whore and so desperate for recognition. He gives himself his own nickname. He doesn't even give the media the chance to come up with their own nickname because, as we know, they always do that when it comes to these killers. But he states facts that only the murderer could know about the Ontario murders. And the reason that he does this is because there was 3 brothers in a psychiatric facility and they were claiming they were responsible for the Otero family killing. And Dennis was like, oh hell no. He was proud of his work and he wanted to ensure that he was credited appropriately. I have never known someone who craved attention so much as Dennis Rader. Like, desperation station, it is embarrassing. And you might wonder, you might speculate and you might ask questions. Did his wife really have no idea what was going on? And the truthful answer, no. She said he must have been very good at leading a double life because she never suspected a thing. Neither did their children. His children had stated the only thing he was guilty of, the only bad trait he had, was being a strict Christian father. And listen, Paul is saying, I never suspected a thing, I didn't know what was going on, I could never have believed what was going on. But shortly before his next murder, she would find a drafted letter. Or, shall we call it a poem, because I think he was going for poetry with this. And it was titled Shirley Locks. And in this poem he had wrote, "Thou shalt not scream, but lay on cushion and think of me in death." Paula doesn't ask any questions. She doesn't think there's anything untoward going on when she witnesses her husband circling and ripping out pages in the newspaper that talks specifically about BTK, the serial killer. And listen, we can't blame her. We really can't, because this man committed the crimes himself. But, would red flags be waving? I would have thought so. So then on March the 17th, 1977, so there is a bit of a gap between the crimes, okay? He had his little hiatus years when he was just, taking a break, taking a holiday. But Dennis Rader had a plan for this day, but this was a plan that wouldn't go as planned. But he was eager to commit his next murder, and this is when he sees 7-year-old Stephen Relford walking down the street. Now, Dennis Rader, he thinks he's a bit of a smooth operator, right? So he goes up to young Steve and he claims to this little boy, I'm a detective, I've got a photo here, can you please identify who it is in this photo? Young Steve, 7-year-old, looks at the photo and misidentifies it as his mother, and his sister. This is perfect for Dennis because now he has a lead. Dennis Rader then follows young Steve back to the Relford residence. It was almost like a wolf trailing a young rabbit. Young Steve opens the door, Dennis Rader goes inside. Once he's inside, he says his spiel. I'm a detective. Here's the photo. Do you recognise these people? And this is when the curtain would fall, when Shirley gets up close to look at this image. Suddenly, Dennis Rader, he pulls a gun. He forces himself towards Shirley. He claims that he is a wanted man. Oh, and by the way, you're also being robbed. And the children, they become part of this horrific scene, okay? They're there, they're present when this is happening, and Dennis, he tries to tie up the children, but it's proven too difficult for him. You know, they're wriggling around, he doesn't have the patience for it. So he takes the children, he puts them in the bathroom, and apparently he had given them like toys and stuff to play with. I don't know how true that is, but apparently. And then he barricades the bathroom door with help from Shirley. Now, how much help was this, or was she being forced to do it? But it might be possible at the same time when Shirley was helping barricade the door, it could be possible she felt like she was protecting her children. Maybe she was barricading it as much as she could, so it was too much effort for Dennis to try and tear everything away to get to the children. Shirley was taken to a nearby bedroom and she was completely nauseated by everything that was going on. I mean, how could you not be? The panic, the nerves, I can't even imagine what she was going through. And not only this, but she's also thinking about her children who are locked in the bathroom. And if she thinks that she could possibly die, she's wondering what's going to happen to them. Dennis was apparently very inconvenienced by the fact that Shirley had vomited. He also didn't have patience for this. This wasn't within his plan. Dennis then handcuffs Shirley and ties her leg to the bedpost before grabbing a bag and putting this over her head. He then puts rope around her neck. He starts strangling her, but he's sort of starting and stopping. At one point, Shirley asks if she could please have a drink of water. And again, he gives her it, like almost mocking and faking compassion. He gives her a drink of this water, but he is going to murder her and she would be strangled to death. Now, Dennis would later admit that he had planned that he was going to kill the children as well, but fate or just divine intervention had intervened and a phone call had come through into the family home, and the children had apparently shouted that this was someone who was due to come over. So that spooked Dennis and he fled. But he was going to murder these children. But thankfully, these children would be left alive in the bathroom. And then we have 25-year-old Nancy Fox. Nancy didn't realise that she was being stalked by horrifying evil. And she had no idea that December the 8th of 1977 would be her last night alive. Dennis Rader, he would refer to Nancy Fox as Project Fox Hunt. Dennis does his usual thing. He waits until he knows that Nancy is out. He broke in through a window and then he waits for Nancy to arrive home. And when she does, she is greeted by this monster. When Nancy sees Dennis, she lets out a manic scream. She is terrified. She tells him, get out, I'm going to call the police. I'll get the police on their way. You better leave before they get here. And Dennis didn't budge. He just looked at her smugly and coldly because he knew. He had already cut the phone lines and he told Nancy this, taking away any last bit of hope she might have had. Dennis Rader then proceeds to tell Nancy, I'm going to restrain you and then I'm going to rape you. Dennis had allowed Nancy to smoke a cigarette and also use the bathroom. Now, this was all under the condition that when she exited the bathroom, she had to be partially naked. When Nancy comes out of the bathroom, Dennis then comes over. He is removing the rest of her clothes and she is trying to resist, but Dennis restrains her and he tells her, this is part of the deal. You have to be naked. This sleep paralysis looking demon then climbs on top of Nancy, who is now handcuffed at this time, and he puts his belt around her neck and he starts tightening it and loosening it, tightening it and loosening it, playing with Nancy, terrifying Nancy. Is she going to die? Is she going to live? But as you can imagine, Dennis Rader, he eventually tightens that belt and doesn't loosen it. And Nancy would die of strangulation. And the day after this beast has murdered Nancy Fox, he would then go to a payphone and he uses this payphone to call the police to notify them that if they go to Nancy Fox's house, they'll find her dead body. Yet again, this desperate attention-seeking freak can't wait for her to be discovered by someone else. He needs it done now. He needs the attention. He needs BTK's name out in frickin' headlights. Now, this call had been recorded and it would be released in 1979 in the hopes that someone might be able to identify this man's voice. However, there was hundreds of leads that came in, but none of them led anywhere. And then we come to 63-year-old Anna Williams. Anna Williams was supposed to be a victim of BTKs. So Anna was out this evening, Dennis knew it, that's why he broke in the first place. He is waiting on Anna coming home. The hours are going by and Dennis starts getting a bit raging. He's like stewing in his own anger because Anna's taken too long. The victim is taking too long to come home and get murdered, right? Anna's out visiting friends and she wouldn't come home until 1 a.m. But by then, Dennis Rader had left. He grew too impatient. He didn't want to wait any longer on Anna. And Anna survived. Could you imagine if this woman had come home earlier? She would have been another victim of BTK. But because she had a late night with her friends, she would survive. So now we're on February the 10th of 1978 and BTK, yet again, he's needing his little ego boost, he's needing attention, and he would send another letter, but this time it wasn't to the Wichita Eagle, it was to a Wichita TV station called Cake. Yet again, Dennis is proclaiming that he is the one who murdered the Otero family, and he gives them a couple of options for names that he can go by, but you know, the preferred one is BTK. But this still wasn't enough for Dennis. Like little Den, he needs all eyes on him. He needs his name in flashing lights. And he decides he's going to send another letter. And in this letter, he states, "How many do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention? How embarrassing. How desperate and pathetic." Now, what is chilling is enclosed within this letter was a mocking poem. This had been written by Dennis and it was a parody of an American folk song called "Oh Death," and this had been titled "Oh Death to Nancy." Now, Dennis Rader's wife Paula, at this point, she's seeing all these letters and things from BTK being put on the news, in the papers, on television, and she's looking one night and she's like, that's weird. He misspells the same kind of words that Dennis misspells. But again, like nothing clicked. And this is probably because she couldn't believe that her loving Christian husband would be capable of something so heinous. She pokes fun at Dennis and she mocks him by saying, "You write like BTK. You misspell like BTK. You've got the handwriting of BTK," all whilst having no idea. But again, Paula, she doesn't mention anything, she doesn't ask questions, just like she never asked any questions about the big sealed box in their bedroom. She just knew it was Dennis's and she wasn't supposed to go inside it. But if she had went inside it, if she had become curious, she would have found a treasure trove of horrors. Dennis referred to this sealed box as his mother lode, and inside the mother lode was mementos from BTK victims. There was crime scene photos, there was dead women's underwear, driver's licenses, pictures of him bound and gagged taking selfies in women's underwear. There was also photos of him trying to choke himself out and also burying himself alive. At this point, police are very much aware that BTK, he obviously watches the news and in particular, he really likes the TV station Cake. So they decide, we're going to start sending this guy subliminal messages. So this subliminal message pops up and it is upside down glasses, as found at the scene of Nancy's murder. And with the glasses, there was a message. And this message said, "Now call the chief." They had hoped that, possibly this killer, because he's sort of getting the interaction that he wants, maybe he would contact the police. But of course, he never did. So by the mid-1980s, BTK had still not been identified. No one had a clue who BTK was. Now, investigators, they had launched a project and this task force team, and they called that Ghostbusters. Over the span of 3 years, they were testing blood samples with saliva samples of over 200 men. Now, every single person, bar 7, they were ruled out as a possible suspect. However, the other remaining 7, there wasn't enough of a match to actually say one of them could have been BTK. So that kind of dries that search up, and they're still looking for who this guy actually is. And whilst Dennis Rader has cooling off periods from his murders, he doesn't cool off from being a creep, because he was still harassing women, stalking women. He even had restraining orders put against him, like, such a freak. And he was taking photos of women's houses and things when they were outside them or when they were inside them, and people are like, what the hell is this creep up to? Then on April the 27th of 1985, Dennis Rader, he is leading like a scouts outing type thing, like the Cub Scouts outing. And he gets to a point within this outing where he starts to say that he's got a headache. He's like, but who's paying attention? Oh my God, my head. I'm sorry. Continue on without me. Go on, enjoy yourselves, but I need to go home. So he fakes his headache, telling everyone, I just need to go home. I need some rest, blah, 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 blah. But what he's actually going to do is drive to a deserted area. He is going to get changed out of his Cub Scouts outfit. And then he's going to go to a bowling alley, order a beer, and just chill there for a period of time. Now, whilst he orders this beer, he basically gets it and he's like swishing it around his mouth and then splashing it on his clothes, like so he would smell like alcohol. And I don't know if this was like so when the taxi picked him up, because yeah, he calls a taxi, he's not driving, okay, he calls taxi. I don't know if it's so he could pretend that he was drunk, and then when he's approaching his victim's house, if anyone else is there, he can just act like drunk and disorientated. I don't know. But his taxi arrives at the bowling alley and picks him up, and it would drop him off one street away from the home of 53-year-old Maren Hedge. Dennis did as he always did. He cut the phone lines, he broke into the home, and then he decided he was going to hide in Maren's bedroom closet, waiting on her return. However, when she returns later, she returns home with a male companion. And when I was reading this, I was hoping in my mind that this would be enough to deter Dennis, but he was so eager to murder at this point that he waits it out in this bedroom closet until this man left. So this man leaves, Maren goes to bed, and once Dennis believes that she's asleep, he comes out of the closet, he creeps along her bedroom, turns on the bedroom light, and stands in the middle of the floor. This light, of course, wakes up Maren. She is startled. She's terrified because who the hell is this in the middle of her room? But Dennis moves so quick. He immediately subdues her. He has her restrained. He handcuffs her. And then he strangles her to death. But this wasn't enough for Dennis at this point. He decides he needs to go a step further. He undresses Maren, strips her completely naked. He then took her out to the car, puts her in the car, drives her to the Christian Lutheran church, the one that he holds a key for. He takes her inside and he covers the church window with like black plastic so no one could see that the lights were being turned on, because, I'm not being funny, church lights on in the middle of the night, it's not really something that you see. Probably would have raised alarms. Once he does this, he would pose Maren all throughout the church in different areas and different positions, and he was photographing her. When he was finished doing what he was doing, he drove Maren's body away from the church. He then dumped her naked, lifeless body in a ditch and then covered her up with some brush. Then we come to September the 16th of 1986, and Dennis Rader at this point, as we know, is an ATD installer by day and a sadistic serial killer by night. Or, well, apparently really whenever the mood struck him. So Dennis, this day, he is out on a job and he would spot 28-year-old Vicky Lynn Wedgerly. And immediately, he already refers to her as Project Piano. Now, the reason he referred to her as Project Piano was because he had actually heard Vicky playing the piano through the walls of her home. Then what Dennis does is he puts on like this little outfit. He's got a hard hat, he's got like a manual type thing, and he basically says to Vicky, I'm here to fix your phone line, may I come in? And Vicky, she doesn't even think twice. I mean, this looks like a legit man. He's in an outfit that would make you believe that he works for a phone repair company. He's got a manual, like what's not to believe? Vicky lets him inside. And at first, he plays nice, he's chit-chatting away, he's making conversation, he even checks the phone. And then he looks around the home to see if there's any other like technical things he could check for her. But in BTK fashion, he very quickly pulls a gun, turns the whole thing on its head, and forces her into the bedroom. And BTK having a gun, he was expecting that Vicky would just go down without a fight, but he was wrong, because Vicky, she fought, she scratched, and she scratched like hell. She scratched him so deeply that BTK, years later, said that he still has a scar from the attack. And in case you don't know, scratching someone who is attacking you is probably the best way to get as much DNA as you possibly can. Get that all tucked under your fingernail so we can sail these monsters down the river. Now, Vicky's dog had started going crazy, like barking, kind of alerting people that something was wrong in the house. The windows to her home were also open, and she warned Dennis that her husband was going to be home soon. And Dennis panicked, but disturbingly, he still made time to kill her. He would strangle Vicky to death. He even made time to take photos of Vicky's lifeless body, and then he fled in her own vehicle. Dennis is driving down the street. He's driving away from Vicky's home, and guess who he passes? Vicky's husband. Vicky's husband's like, where the hell's Vicky off to? Who's that in the car? So confused. And little did he know this was his wife's murderer. Now later, Dennis would ditch Vicky's car in a grocery store parking lot. He then drove his own car home. But before he drove home, do you want to know what he did? He circled Vicky's house, and he circled that house because he wanted to watch as the paramedics tried to save this woman's life. That is the kind of sicko we're up against here. Now it's January the 18th of 1991, and we arrive at 62-year-old Dolores Davis. She had lived just a couple of miles away from Dennis, and he was stalking her for weeks. Now he had referred to Dolores as Project Dogside, and that was because she had kennels near her home. Now that night he's looking for an excuse to get out so he can murder Dolores, and he claims that there's a Boy Scout camping trip that he has to go to. You know, he's a responsible adult, he needs to look out for these young men. So Dennis, he parks at the church that he had the keys to, he crosses a frozen wheat field and a cemetery, and then he smashed his way into Dolores's home with a cinder block. This woman woke up, she was startled, she was screaming, she was completely terrified. And what did Dennis do? He gives his usual spiel. I'm a wanted man, I need food, I need shelter, I need a car, and I need your money. But when Dolores refused to hand over her hard-earned things, Dennis then pulls out a gun and a knife. And then Dolores complied until she realised what was coming. Dolores would beg for her life so many times, and she was begging as Dennis tied her up with her own pantyhose. He then strangled Dolores to death. He dumped her body under a bridge that was miles away. But Dennis is like really paranoid these days, so he comes back again later and then moves her somewhere else. Her body would be found 2 weeks later by a 15-year-old boy who was out walking his dog. Could you imagine the mental scarring that's inflicted on that young boy? The images that will be in his head for the rest of his life. By the early 2000s, Dennis Rader, aka BTK, he was just like any other suburban dad in Kansas. He was worrying about his lawn, he was worrying about making sure it was 1-inch grass, and worrying about church bake sales, all whilst he sat on top of one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in America at that time. He had been silent for over a decade, and by this point people were speculating he must be dead, he must be locked up, maybe he's in jail, maybe he's in a mental facility, or maybe he finally got distracted by reality TV like the rest of us. But no, Dennis wasn't locked up, he wasn't dead, unfortunately. He was just bored. And for a man whose hobbies were stalking women, stealing women's underwear, murdering women, burying women, being bored, kind of a dangerous thing to feel. So then in 2004, the Wichita Eagle, they post this 30th anniversary for the Otero family murders. When they're talking about this case, they refer to it as a cold case. When Dennis sees this, he grows enraged. It's not a cold case, he's BTK. BTK still exists. He took this personally. He took this as an insult because to him, BTK doesn't go cold. BTK is a super predator, which is his words, by the way, not mine. And like any other narcissist who has been completely starved of attention, Dennis decides that it was time for a comeback tour. And he starts off small, okay? It's going to get worse and worse and worse, but it starts off small, dropping off packages containing victim photos and chilling letters into a UPS box. Then he gets a bit weirder and he's sending word puzzles to TV stations. Think Zodiac meets Scrabble. That kind of hybrid. He then left a doll that was dressed like one of his victims, bound and gagged in a cereal box in the middle of the road. A cereal box, like Tony the Tiger is somewhere shuddering. So then March 19th of 2004, the Wichita Eagle, they receive a letter from Bill Thomas Killman. And this Bill Thomas Killman was claiming that BTK had murdered Vicky Wedgerly back in 1986. And inside with this letter was crime scene photos and her stolen driver's license. This was solid proof that the person who was communicating with them was in fact BTK. Now DNA from under Vicky's fingernails, this sparks a mass sweep. 1,300 men would be tested against this DNA. This included police officers, doctors, professionals of every calibre. But of course, Dennis Rader himself, he hasn't been tested. So, you know, BTK, still undiscovered. And we know this desperado just loves the spotlight. So over the next year, he keeps sending these letters and these packages. Fake IDs, word puzzles, creepy sketches, dolls bound and gagged like his victims. And he's dropping these boxes with these items at local parks, at local libraries, in your local grocery store. And then Dennis, he starts getting even bolder because, let's be honest, this idiot, he needs attention like it's oxygen. And he truly thinks at this point that he's running the whole damn show. So he's running around town, he's leaving these manila envelopes everywhere with crime scene photos, sketches, letters, everything. But his piece de resistance was always the cereal boxes. So one day, desperate Den, he gets a special case cereal box and he hid it in the bed of a random truck at Home Depot. Now, the truck owner, they walk out, they see this cereal box, they peek inside, and it's a doll who looks to be bound and gagged, and they think, hell no, I'm not keeping this in my truck, and they just throw it away. Like, they don't alert anyone, they just chuck it. And then later, BTK, he's like, they've not responded to my doll, like, they've not responded to my special case cereal box, what's going on? He is so furious that the police didn't respond to his message. So he gets in communication with them again and he's whinging away and he's like, did you not get my cereal box at Home Depot? But this whinge that he has, this would ultimately be what saves lives because police are like, oh, surveillance at Home Depot, we could check that, we could see if there's anyone seen dumping that. And what do you know? Police, they catch a black Jeep Cherokee circling the parking lot right where that cereal box was left. And this would be their first solid lead in decades. Now, whilst police had this first solid lead that they've had in decades, right, Dennis wasn't ready to hand himself over. I mean, Dennis planned on never ever handing himself over. And in January of 2005 would come something that is gonna go down in the Hall of Fame for criminal stupidity. Because Dennis decides that he is gonna send the police a postcard. And in this postcard, he has a very, very important question to ask them. So he says, can I communicate with you through a floppy disk? Be honest. If I send one, will you be able to trace it? Like, did you think you were going to get a truthful answer? Like, seriously. Now, the police, I imagine them, like, stifling some laughter there, okay, because how frickin' stupid is this guy? But they reply in a newspaper classified ad, and they say, Rex, it will be safe. Now, they refer to him as Rex because Dennis loves to be called by his chosen nickname, and Rex was one of his favourites because Rex meant king, and he's a narcissist. He loves to be old King Dennis, little King Rex. And then lo and behold, it's February the 16th, 2005, and there arrives a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk. This arrived at KSAS TV, which was like a local news station. And inside this floppy disk, right, there was a Word document. And this is BTK going on one of his rambles, and he's talking about how it's a new chapter and new beginnings for BTK. He has big plans for the future. But what Dennis didn't realise is that metadata is a thing, and that this Word document that he used, it contained digital fingerprints. The author of this document was listed as Dennis. It was last saved by Dennis. And the last modification, this occurred at the Christian Lutheran Church. So police, they're immediately cross-checking the staff within the Christian Lutheran Church, and they find one Dennis. Dennis Rader, president of the church council. Now, they cross-reference this with the black Jeep Cherokee at the Home Depot parking lot. Bingo. Now, whilst the police has this, right, and I think this is like a hefty amount of evidence, but the police say, we need something ironclad, something that he can't get out of. So what they do is they obtain a warrant, and the warrant that they obtain is for a pap smear sample from Dennis Rader's daughter when she was at Kansas State University. Now, DNA from this sample had matched genetic material that had been found under Vicky Wedgerly's nails, one of BTK's victims. And would you know it? The mask is finally off. BTK revealed. So then on February the 25th of 2005, Dennis Rader, he would be arrested whilst he was driving home for lunch. Now the police asked him, do you know why we're arresting you? Do you know why you're getting taken downtown? And Dennis, he thinks he's like this super villain, right? And he has like a little smirk. And he says, oh, I have my suspicions. He's sitting there acting like this thing was ended on his terms, and that's not the case, because the reason he was caught was because, number one, allowed himself to be caught in CCTV footage, and number two, because the loser, freak, weirdo, stupid idiot didn't even know how Microsoft Word worked. Embarrassing. Now, whilst BTK, Dennis Rader, sat in cuffs, his house of horrors would be completely raided. The police, they had scooped away his computer, they had found black pantyhose in his shed, and they also found a very mysterious cylindrical container, which, you know, with these serial killers and weirdos, it's never anything good. They had even tore through the church, the local library, and by the next morning, they were able to announce to the world, BTK is arrested. And to the wider public, this translated to decades of nightmares has just ended. And Dennis Rader, he wasn't feeling too hot when he arrived at prison. He started to really worry about himself, you know? Is he going to be in like some kind of like private housing, or will he be put in with the loons, as he referred to them? He also asked if the death penalty would be on the table. He was very, very concerned for his own life. Just not that of the women, men and children that he had murdered. Kansas didn't have the death penalty at the time when he was killing, but he would be served something worse in many people's eyes, and that was life in prison. On June the 27th of 2005, Dennis Rader would plead guilty. In the open court, he had calmly expressed every single detail of his brutal murders. He was even referring to his victims as projects. It was almost like he was presenting his portfolio to the court. There was no remorse, there was no apology. He didn't seem to care. This was just a monster narrating his own evil. August 18th would be the time that he was sentenced, and families, of course, they get to come forward and give their statements to the court, to the judge. These are all people who are mourning the loss of their loved one. But Dennis just sat there stone-faced the entire time that they got to talk, because Dennis wants the attention on him. He doesn't want to give attention to anyone else. However, Dennis started to look very alert when it was his time to talk, and he gave a 30-minute rambling speech. I mean, I think it was meant to be an apology, but it definitely wasn't. And to be honest, the way he was wording it and describing it, it sounded more like an award acceptance speech. Even the prosecutor had described it as something out of Hollywood. Psychologists would later call it pure psychopathy. Now, his diagnosis: narcissistic, obsessive compulsive, and antisocial. So basically the human equivalent of a virus. Dennis Rader would be given 10 consecutive life sentences, which was 175 years in prison. And of course, they couldn't kill him, but they did bury him alive at El Dorado Correctional Facility. And you know, it's not exactly the place to be. On the 40-minute drive to El Dorado, Dennis Rader spoke to the people in the vehicle, the police, the officers who were escorting him, like they were friends. He was talking about the weather. He was making general chit-chat that you would, like the kind of conversation you would have with your taxi driver. The radio in the vehicle had then started playing the victim impact statements, and according to the people in the car, Dennis Rader actually shed a tear. But of course, it wasn't because what he'd done. He probably just realised that his reign of terror and his life as he knew it was over. He's been in solitary ever since, and that's like a special status which makes sure that he lives long enough to die slowly. In 2006, he would be awarded for his good behaviour. He would get radio, books, art supplies, because nothing says justice like giving a sadistic serial killer a sketch pad when what he was known for sketching was his victims. Now, the prosecution, they fought against this because they believed that these privileges that were being granted to him, he would use them to fuel his sick fantasies. Spoiler alert, they were right. So BTK's daughter, Kerry Rawson, she actually released A Serial Killer's Daughter in 2019. This basically details how she unknowingly grew up in the shadows of BTK. She never knew her father was BTK. And despite this, she still struggles to reconcile her normal childhood with her father's atrocities. Now, by 2023, she had actually went to visit her father, and she had found that he had shrunk basically by 7 inches. He looked old and gone. He was confined to a wheelchair and he was miserable. And then in 2024, just last year at CrimeCon, Kerry Rawson, she dropped a bomb that I'm not sure anyone was expecting. It was excerpts from BTK's journal, her father's journal, that detailed that he had sexually abused her as a young child. Not only was he a sadistic, evil murderer, he was a predator in his own home to his own child. Now, in terms of other murders, when BTK was arrested and once he was convicted, police, they had went through Kansas cold cases. They were looking for anything that might be tied to BTK, but ultimately nothing stuck. He had admitted to stalking dozens of women, but he had said that the 10 murders he confessed to were the only ones that he committed. And people believe that because, well, he liked to brag, and surely if he had murdered more, he would have bragged even more. However, in 2023, investigators had unearthed what they believed to be trophies from his home. And there was one case that had immediately stood out to them, and that was the 1976 disappearance of 16-year-old Cynthia Dawn Kinney. She had been abducted from an Oklahoma laundromat, and Rader's write-ins, the ones that they had found, mentioned a bad wash day. He had worked ADT installs just across the street at the time that Cynthia had went missing. And he admitted that one time he had actually fantasized about abducting and murdering a young woman from a laundromat. He is deemed to be the prime suspect in this case, but Dennis Rader himself, he completely denies it. But it is believed that he denies it because Oklahoma, they do have the death penalty, and he would rather be confined to his little concrete coffin than face death, rotting away and still hiding secrets. Dennis Rader, he wants you to remember him as BTK, and he wants you to remember him as a criminal mastermind. But he's not. He's a pathetic, desperate loser who was so desperate for attention that it led to his very own stupidity. He's just a pathetic old man surrounded by the ghosts of every single life that he destroyed. And respectfully, I hope when the Grim Reaper does come to collect him, I hope his death is painful, I hope he suffers, and I hope he burns in hell. I know some people don't like when I say stuff like that, but it's true.